Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into the shadowy corners of the medieval Europe, the kind of corners the church liked to keep tightly sealed and dust-free. We're talking about forbidden love, the kind of love that got people exiled, executed, or excommunicated. The kind of love where you probably won't survive this, but hey, at least you'll feel something on the way down, right? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments what city you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That's always fun. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're stepping softly on cold stone, candlelight flickering against walls veined with age and incense. You're in the cloister of a convent, quiet, serene, utterly still. Except, not entirely. There's a hum of something unspoken here. Tension. A breath that won't quite exhale. You follow it, curious. And that's when you see her. She's sitting in the chapel, not praying. Not really. Her eyes are locked on the heavy oak door as if waiting for it to open. Her name is Elellanena, daughter of a king sworn to God, and completely in love with someone who is very much not God. See, Elellanena didn't choose this life. Her father, King Henry, saw fit to ship her off at 14 when she became too much of a pawn for other kings to try and marry. If she became a bride of Christ, then no one else could lay claim to her. Not legally, not politically, and certainly not romantically. But Elellanena was never built for silence and stone. She had the mind of a poet and the soul of a storm. She wrote verses in secret, buried them in the folds of her psalter, and one of those verses made its way into the hands of a very unexpected reader, Brother Thomas. Now Thomas wasn't just any monk. He was a royal tutor in the king's court before taking his vows, a learned man, handsome in a serious, quiet way, with shoulders broad from hauling water and eyes that stayed locked just a little too long. When he came to the convent to oversee the education of the nuns, he never expected to fall in love, but love rarely asks for permission. It started innocently. A comment during a lesson on Latin, a shared look over a candle-lit manuscript. And then, one winter night, Elellanena slipped out of her cell and met him beneath the cloister arch. Snow clung to the edges of her veil. He looked at her like she was made of stars, and in that stolen moment, something unholy and utterly human happened. This wasn't just about passion, though yes, there was plenty of that. It was about rebellion, against the chains of expectation, against a church that said your body wasn't yours, against a father who thought locking her away would end the story. But Elellanena rewrote her fate in the margins. They met in secret for months, in the chapel, in the scriptorium, sometimes even behind the altar. At one point, Thomas carved a hollow into a prayer bench to leave her notes. It became their hidden postbox, a medieval mailbox of madness and romance. There's actually a fragment of one of his letters that still survives in a private collection. It ends with the words, "Though I walk among saints, it is your heresy that saves me." But nothing gold stays. And the danger wasn't abstract. One night, a novice followed Elellanena. She saw them kiss beneath the broken stained glass window near the crypt. Within hours, bells rang. Thomas was dragged away in chains. Elellanena, locked in a stone cell beneath the convent, fed only bread and water for 40 days. Now here's where things get fuzzy, and historians still argue. Some say Thomas was executed quietly. Others claim he was sent to a remote monastery in the north, his tongue cut out so he could never speak her name again. But a few fringe scholars believe something far wilder, that he escaped and Elellanena broke out with him, that they fled across the channel to a hidden priory in Normandy, living under new names. There's even a local legend in a French village that speaks of an English nun and her silent lover who lived near the coast, tending to the poor and never speaking of the past. Whatever the truth, Elellanen's story vanishes from the royal records. It's like someone scrubbed her existence clean, which, let's be honest, only makes it more suspicious. Here's your historical fact. Convents were often used as political tools. Unwanted daughters, rival queens and scandal makers were locked away under the guise of piety. Not out of faith, but convenience. Fringe fact, there are documented cases of hidden passageways built beneath some nunneries, often chalked up to emergency escape routes, but you know how that goes. More likely they were used for forbidden visitors like knights or lovers or exiled scholars with charming smiles. Debated idea. Did Elellanena and Thomas die in shame, or did they start over? Mainstream history likes clean endings, but human stories don't usually cooperate. Maybe she lived to be a ghost story in 2 countries. Whatever the truth, as you walk away from the flickering chapel, you can still feel her presence there. A whisper under your breath. A question lingering at the back of your throat. What would you risk for love? You're standing in the shadows of a great hall now, one of those stone-beamed chambers where echoes bounce off the walls and secrets rot in the rafters. The banners are still, the fire is low. You keep your distance from the throne, but your eyes are on the queen. She's seated near the fire, her back straight, her eyes hollowed out by thought. A heavy gold circlet rests on her brow, but it might as well be a shackle. Her name is Isolde, and she's married to King Aldrich of Mercia, a man known more for conquest than kindness. He's not here right now. He's out burning villages in the name of expansion. And she's burning for someone entirely different. You glance across the hall and spot him, Sir Rowan, the king's most loyal knight. Broad-chested, stoic, a warrior moulded from oak and regret. His tunic is frayed at the collar. His sword arm bears the memory of too many battles. But right now he's fighting something even harder. Desire that has no place in this room. It started after one of the northern campaigns. Isolde, tending the wounded in the aftermath of battle, stumbled upon Rowan's tent. His ribs were broken, his armour slick with dried blood. He should have died. He didn't. She nursed him back in silence, her fingers brushing his skin with a care that startled them both. He told her once, half conscious, that her touch felt like mercy. No one had ever called her merciful before, and from then on the lines began to blur. A glance across the council chamber, a whispered joke in the stables. He carved a tiny falcon for her out of yew wood and tucked it behind her prayer cushion. She pressed a pressed violet into the leather lining of his gauntlet. And though they never spoke the words aloud, everyone in court saw the space between them tighten like a bowstring. The problem? This wasn't some pastoral love affair between commoners who could disappear into the woods. This was treason. If anyone had proof, it would be over. Not just scandal, execution, beheading, maybe worse. So they spoke in symbols. He trained his falcon to land only on her windowsill. She developed a new embroidery pattern, knotted ropes with no beginning or end, little clues, coded emotions stitched into the fabric of daily life. A medieval language of longing. But you know how this goes. Someone always notices. In this case, it was the king's cousin, Lord Bioka, a sour man with a nose for rot. He saw the falcon one morning, perched too calmly on the queen's sill. He saw the way Sir Rowan's eyes lingered a heartbeat too long. He saw, and he plotted. One night, Rowan was summoned to the king's chamber. Alone, no guards, no preamble, just a quiet room and a flagon of wine. "Do you love my wife?" the king asked. Rowan, being a man of very little fiction, said nothing. "Say it," the king ordered. But Rowan remained silent. Here's the thing. There's a law at this time, a weird, rarely used one, that silence in the face of a royal accusation could be treated as confession. A loophole. Convenient, isn't it? So the king decided to make an example of him, not by death. No, that would be too easy, too merciful. Instead, Rowan was exiled, stripped of knighthood and branded. Branded like cattle. They used hot iron to sear a mark into his chest. A crown split down the middle. The next morning, Isolde woke to find the falcon dead on her windowsill. Poisoned, its tiny talons curled, its wings stiff. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just sat in her chamber, stitched one last tapestry of a falcon flying away, and then stopped speaking. She never spoke again, not publicly. Some say it was grief, others say it was punishment, a private penance. The king forbade anyone to mention Sir Rowan again. His name was removed from court records. Erased. But of course, stories live outside parchment. Here's your historical fact. Medieval courts were brimming with politics, but the queen's power was often indirect, through influence, not decree. That influence, however, made her a threat if it was directed toward anyone but the king. Fringe fact. There's a half-burned love poem in Old English discovered in a chapel near Mercia, written in a woman's hand. It's unsigned, but scholars suspect it could be Isolde's. The final line reads, "And though my mouth is closed, my heart is a horn that breaks itself to sound." Debated idea. Was Rowan truly exiled, or executed secretly? Some think the king staged the branding but killed him that same night. Others believe Rowan fled to Ireland, where a warrior with a split crown scar was said to guard a ruined chapel for years. All you know is this: sometimes love doesn't end with a sword. Sometimes it just echoes, in rooms where no one speaks, in falcons that never fly again, in the eyes of a queen who stares through a fire and doesn't blink. You step back from the hall now, the silence presses against your ears. You can almost hear her breath, steady, measured, deliberate. There's still power in silence and sorrow, and somewhere buried beneath layers of duty and regret, a love that might have cracked the kingdom in half if it had been allowed to bloom. The scent hits you first, hay, leather, and something sweet on the wind, like early apples ripening on the branch. You're in the stables now, tucked behind the towering stone walls of a castle, and the world out here moves at a slower rhythm. No grand speeches, no echoing halls, just the clump of hooves, the snort of resting horses, and the rustle of straw beneath your feet. He's there, shirt damp with sweat, hair tangled, hands rough and scarred. Just a stable boy. His name is Finn. No last name, no title, no claim to anything except what he earns with his back. He's young but not naive, always watching, always listening. His world is mud and muscle, a quiet orbit around beasts and nobles who never learn his name. But one did. Her name is Princess Adela, and she shouldn't be here. Not now, not ever. She's supposed to be at court, learning the delicate politics of alliance and betrayal, sitting still in velvet, saying the right things in the right order. Instead, she's ducked out of a lesson on heraldry to watch Finn from behind a wooden beam, her breath catching every time he brushes the mane of a warhorse or whispers something kind into the ear of a jittery mare. The first time she speaks to him, it's to ask what he's feeding the palfrey. Her voice is too high, too careful. He doesn't look up at first, just mutters something about oats. When he does glance over, his eyes meet hers like an arrow hitting soft flesh. He blinks, she stares. Neither one of them says the obvious thing, which is, "What are you doing here?" From that moment on, the dance begins. She finds excuses to pass through the stables. He pretends not to notice, until one day, he leaves a wildflower on the bench where she always lingers. And that's it. The floodgate. Their love grows in half-hidden moments, in shadows between stalls, in laughter smothered with a hand over the mouth, in nights where she sneaks out past the guards, barefoot, cloak pulled tight, to lie on a bed of straw beside him. He tells her stories, legends passed down from his mother. She recites poems she's been forced to memorize, mocking the ridiculous way court nobles pronounce Latin. It's idyllic, yes, but it's also stupid, dangerously so. Because Adela is not just a princess, she's a promised bride, a piece of a political puzzle. She's been betrothed to Prince Theodoric of Burgundy since she was 11. He's already sent her gifts: gold-threaded gloves, a tiny ivory crucifix, a lock of his own oily hair. The wedding's in a year. Her future's set. But try telling that to her heart. They talk once about running away. It's late. A storm rumbling in the distance, the horses stamping with unease. She's curled beside him, cheek against his chest. "We could disappear," she whispers. "Steal a horse, ride west, go where no one knows my name." Finn wants to believe it. Wants to believe they could become anonymous, just two travellers with windburned faces and calloused hands. But even in the dark, the lie tastes bitter. They'd be hunted within days. She'd be dragged back. He'd be hanged. And sure enough, someone sees them. It's always someone. This time it's her handmaid, Clara. Poor Clara, torn between loyalty and terror. She confesses everything to the Queen, Adela sneaking out, the straw in her hair, the muddy hem on her nightgown. What follows is swift, brutal. Finn is seized, beaten within inches of his life and locked in a dungeon. Adela is placed under house arrest, windows sealed, guards posted. The official story? Nothing. They say she fell ill. They say the stable boys stole from the treasury. They say anything but the truth. Now here's where things get weird. According to a lesser-known chronicle, Finn was scheduled for execution, public hanging in the square. But on the morning of his death, the guard sent to retrieve him found the cell empty. Door locked. No sign of struggle. Just an open window, even though the bars were intact and the drop was fatal. A servant later claimed to have seen a cloaked figure on horseback riding hard toward the forest. Two figures, actually. One of them smaller, thinner. Both moving fast, the story was dismissed. No one pursued it. Officially, Finn was buried in an unmarked grave. Adela was sent away to recover in a distant abbey. Her marriage to Theodoric never happened. She died a year later, or so the record says. Historical fact: royal daughters were often married off before they turned 15, treated more like currency than people. Their romantic lives, if they had any, were usually erased or overwritten. Fringe fact: in a hidden room in a French manor once owned by the Burgundians, a poem was found carved into wood unsigned. It speaks of a woman with fire in her voice and straw in her crown. No known authorship, but it's preserved now in a regional museum. Debated idea: did Finn and Adela actually escape? Some believe they did, living under assumed names in the Southern Territories. Others think the story was manufactured to cover up her suicide, or his murder, or both. One version even claims a noble sympathiser faked Finn's death, and he joined a mercenary band afterward. You listen to the stables now, quiet except for the wind slipping between planks. There's an echo of laughter in the hay, a moment suspended in time. You'll never know the ending, not for sure, but you can feel what it meant. Two people, completely wrong for each other by every law and measure, but completely right in their stolen moments. And sometimes that's enough. The bells toll slowly across the sleepy city, not in celebration, not in mourning, but in warning. A heavy, repetitive clang that says, stay away or maybe look closer if you dare. You're in the heart of a cathedral town now, where stone towers reach like fingers toward heaven, and secrets echo louder than hymns. Everyone here claims holiness, especially the man in the grandest robe of all, the bishop. But tonight, holiness is nowhere to be found in his chambers. His name is Bishop Lambert, a man with a voice like velvet and a mind sharp enough to split hairs. And enemies. He rose faster than anyone expected, rumoured to have outmanoeuvred 2 abbots and a cardinal with little more than well-placed whispers and a suspiciously convenient fire. He delivers sermons that make old women cry and noblemen clutch their relics harder. To the public, he is incorruptible. But tonight, as you creep through the cloisters and into the candlelit warmth of his private study, you find that even the holiest robes hide very human desires. She's already there, curled on a fur throw by the fire. Her name is Mariette, and no one knows exactly where she came from. Some say she was once a laundress in the bishop's household. Others whisper she was a noble's illegitimate daughter. The more dramatic suggests she was a spy, sent to blackmail the bishop. But if that were true, she's doing a terrible job of blackmail. Because the two of them, they're very much in love. Not the kind of love that inspires poems, the dangerous kind, the kind that destroys careers, reputations, and potentially entire dioceses. And yet it's been going on for years, right under everyone's noses. It started the night of a lightning strike. A freak summer storm hit the cathedral, setting fire to one of the west towers. Lambert rushed out in his nightshirt to help put it out, and found Mariette already there, hauling water with the servants. She slipped. He caught her. Classic. Except it didn't end there. They talked that night about fear, about fire, about how very little of this world is actually under our control. And from then on, they were never quite apart. He started arranging longer and longer meetings under the guise of spiritual guidance. She started appearing in his sermons disguised as a soul adrift, longing for good. But the truth bled through. His voice would tremble when she entered the room. He began spending more and more time in his study, candles burning long into the night. And when her monthly allowance was mysteriously quadrupled, the priest began to murmur. Eventually someone spoke out. Not a rival priest, but a visiting monk named Brother Pascal, a rigid soul with a face like a stone wall. He caught them, allegedly, late one night, through the study window. No clothes, no prayers, just soft laughter and limbs intertwined like roots. He didn't confront them directly, of course. No, he wrote a letter, several, actually, to Rome. What followed was an investigation, quiet at first, then increasingly loud. An inquisitor was sent to observe, funds were audited, servants were interrogated, a false relic was conveniently discovered in the bishop's treasury, a saint's finger that, as it turns out, belonged to no saint and no finger. Lambert knew the walls were closing in, so he did something unexpected. He confessed. Sort of. In a sermon broadcast from the pulpit to a packed cathedral, he spoke of forbidden love, of the humanity that bleeds through even the strongest vows, and of a woman who taught him more about grace than any scroll. He never said her name, but everyone knew. The gasps rippled like waves. Some called it brave, others blasphemy. After that, Mariette vanished. Just gone, No record of departure, no final sighting. The bishop continued his duties as if nothing had changed, his beard a little greyer, his eyes a little more tired. When asked about her, he'd smile faintly and say, "God takes what he needs." Years later, a letter surfaced, hidden inside a hollowed-out Bible in the cathedral archives. It was from Lambert to Mariette, or maybe to himself. It read, "I gave them all sermons, but only you ever heard Mo." Historical fact. Bishops in medieval Europe were technically supposed to remain celibate, but enforcement varied wildly. Some kept concubines in secret, others maintained entire families under false names. Fringe fact, in one preserved English cathedral, a secret staircase leads from the bishop's chambers to what used to be the servants' quarters. Officially, it was for emergency egress. Unofficially, many believe it was built to sneak lovers in and out without alerting the clergy. Debated idea, was Mariette real? Some scholars argue she was a metaphor invented by Lambert to test the church's willingness to forgive. Others claim she fled to France under an assumed name and lived out her life in a countryside manor, funded by the very man who broke every rule to love her. You glance around the study before you leave. The fire has gone out, but the chair still holds the shape of a body long gone. On the desk lies a half-burned letter, one corner still smudged with red wax. A ring lies beside it. Gold, simple, no cross, no crest, just a circle uninterrupted. Sometimes that's all a forbidden love leaves behind, a shape where something used to be, and the silence that comes after, like the tolling of bells that no longer ring for saints. The tower looms over the moor like a forgotten tooth, grey and jagged, wrapped in brambles and wind. You're not supposed to be here. No one is. The villagers whisper about it in hushed tones. The Ladies' Tower, they call it. And if you climb the crooked path and step close enough to the moss-covered stones, you'll feel it too. A kind of stillness, heavy, like breath held for 100 years. Inside, the air is thick with dust and the scent of dried flowers, lavender maybe, or what's left of it. A staircase spirals upward, stones worn smooth from pacing feet. At the top, sunlight spills into a chamber barely big enough for a bed, a writing desk, and a tall narrow window facing the woods. This was a prison once. Not for a criminal, but for a noblewoman named Elellanena, locked away by her own family, and from that very window she fell in love. Let's rewind. Elellanena was the third daughter of Lord Berrant, a minor noble with major ambitions. He had no time for daughters unless they could marry into something valuable. The problem was, Elellanena was too curious for her own good. She asked too many questions, refused too many suitors, and developed an unfortunate fondness for astronomy. At one point, she allegedly corrected a bishop's explanation of lunar phases during dinner. That was the final straw. So she was sent to the tower for reflection, the family claimed. For her own safety. But everyone knew the truth. She was being removed, hidden, repackaged until she could be moulded into something more useful. Except Elellanena, even isolated, didn't behave. She brought her books, she brought her telescope, and she brought her stubborn refusal to disappear. From her window she could see the forest path, and it was there that she first noticed the hunter. He came every morning with the rising mist, tall, sun-browned, carrying a bow and a pack of dogs that looked more like wolves. His name was Idris, though she wouldn't learn that until much later. At first, she only watched. He moved differently from the castle men, less rigid, more alive. He laughed with the dogs, sang sometimes, and one day he looked up. Their first meeting wasn't a meeting at all. She dropped a note from her window. He caught it, looked around, confused, read it, smiled. What followed was a courtship by paper. She would leave notes in a hollow tree along the path. He'd answer with little drawings, wildflowers, pressed herbs. Once he left a tiny carved rabbit and wrote, "So you don't forget what moves in the world." It was the strangest, most sincere thing anyone had ever given her. Weeks passed, then months. Their messages grew longer, more urgent. Finally, one twilight she took a risk. She climbed down. No grand escape, no rope made of sheets. She simply waited until her old nurse, her only companion, dozed off, then slipped out the hidden servant stair. She ran through the woods in borrowed boots, her breath sharp, heart louder than the owl's, and he was there, waiting. What happened next was not scandalous by today's standards, but in their worlds it was heresy. They lay together under a tree and spoke of impossible futures. He told her stories of his people, forest-dwelling folk the nobility pretended didn't exist. She shared her star charts, pointing out constellations in the night sky, and for a few hours they weren't prisoner and hunter. They were just Elellanena and Idris. But of course nothing stays hidden forever. The nurse awoke, panicked. The search began. Elellanena was caught returning, mud on her hem, a leaf tangled in her braid. Idris was hunted down, dragged from his home, beaten within an inch of his life. The Lord claimed it was an attempted seduction, called for execution. But here's where things splinter. The official record says Idris died, that he was hanged at dawn behind the castle, body left on display as a warning. But Eleanor's reaction doesn't quite fit. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she went silent, stoic, and she never left the tower again. Not because she wasn't allowed, but because she refused. She returned to her astronomy, stared through her telescope night after night. Some say she lost her mind. Others say she was waiting for a sign. And then, years later, she vanished. No explanation. One morning the tower was empty, food untouched, bed cold, window wide open. At first they assumed suicide, but no body was ever found. Only a final note tucked inside her star map. The hunter waits where the sky begins. Historical fact, noblewomen were often removed to towers or convents for perceived disobedience, especially if they threatened political alliances or family reputations. Fringe fact, in the ruins of a different manor 2 valleys over, someone found a child's blanket embroidered with a pattern matching Eleanor's star charts. It was dated 2 decades after her supposed disappearance. Debated idea. Was Idris really executed? Some believe the guards faked it, bribed by Eleanor's old nurse. One persistent rumour claims he and Elellanena fled north, living under false names near the Scottish border. You stand in the empty tower chamber now, the air still laced with lavender and longing. The telescope remains, its lens cracked. The floor creaks like a held breath. And you wonder, not if they escaped, but if they ever stopped watching the stars. You hear it before you see it. The clang of steel on stone, the creak of a rusted hinge, and the faint flutter of parchment caught in the desert wind. You're standing at the edge of a scorched military camp somewhere near Jerusalem, the year deep in the First Crusade. The banners are foreign, the language fractured, but one thing hasn't changed across centuries or continents. Someone here is in love with the wrong person. It's brutally hot, the kind of dry heat that splits lips and saps sanity. Men stumble through their duties in armour caked with sand and sweat. At the edge of the camp sits a makeshift scriptorium, a half-collapsed tent where scribes record victories that may or may not have happened and rewrite losses into moral lessons. And that's where you find him, Sir Mathieu of Anjou, once a nobleman, now just a half-mad crusader with ink-stained fingers and a secret he's been hiding for over 1,000 miles. He wasn't supposed to survive this war. No one was, really. The Crusades were chaos wrapped in holy language, pilgrims turned soldiers, faith weaponized by desperation. Mathieu came here with a sword and a broken heart, hoping the road east would burn away the memory of a woman he could never have. But the war didn't cleanse him, it only made the memory sharper, more dangerous. Her name was Yasmin, a merchant's daughter from Antioch, sharp-eyed, unafraid. Mathieu met her in the ruins of a village his company had passed through, a place already abandoned, its homes half-eaten by vines. She was scavenging food dressed as a boy. He only realised she wasn't one when she turned and glared at him, daring him to stop her. He didn't. Instead, he followed her, for miles. Eventually she let him catch up. Their connection made no sense. She was a local, possibly Muslim, definitely not Christian. He was a French noble with a crusader's cross stitched over his chest. But she spoke Latin better than most monks, and he, for once, found someone who didn't care about his name or his title. She only cared about the person beneath the armour, the man who hadn't prayed in weeks, who stole water instead of wine, who wrote letters he never sent. That was the first layer of the scandal. The second was worse. She was married. Not just married, betrothed to a city elder in Damascus. The kind of man who'd burn half a village just to prove a point. Yasmin didn't love him, but love was never the point of her marriage. Trade was, survival was. So she and Mathieu met in secret, at first in ruined homes, then in dried-up wells, behind broken idols, even once inside a half-buried crypt. They were like smoke and wind, never seen, never caught. but you can't hide passion like that forever, especially not in a war zone where betrayal hangs thicker than the dust. One night, a soldier from Mathieu's company followed him, saw them, heard them, didn't report it immediately but waited. Traded the knowledge for gold from the city elders' scouts. The next morning, Yasmin was gone. Not captured, just gone. Vanished like water through fingers. Mathieu tore the camp apart, rode for days, questioned every caravan. No sign. He returned to camp hollow-eyed and changed. Stopped fighting, stopped speaking, began writing. His letters to her, hundreds of them, were found years later hidden in a sealed jar beneath the ruins of the camp. The final one reads, "If you ever read this, know that in all the wars I fought, it was loving you that broke me." Now for the strange part. One chronicle from a later crusade mentions a scribe in Damascus who wore a crusader's ring and wrote only in Latin. He was never seen during the day, and his eyes were described as grey with grief. No name, no origin, just that. Historical fact. Relationships between Christian crusaders and Muslim locals were more common than the church wanted to admit, but they were dangerous, punishable by death or disfigurement on both sides. Fringe fact, some crusaders kept journals in cipher, hidden writing systems that only a lover or close confidant could decode. One such book found in a ruined outpost contains passages about Sun Woman who spoke the moon's language. Scholars have no idea what it means, but some think it references a forbidden love. Debated idea. Did Yasmin really leave voluntarily, or was she taken? Some believe she ran to save him, others claim she was murdered. A few argue that she never existed at all, that she was a metaphor for home, or peace, or a conscience too painful to carry. But here's the thing. When you stand near Mathieu's abandoned tent, now eaten by weeds and sand, you can still feel the ghost of their story. The way a forbidden love lingers in places no one visits, in words never delivered, in hands that never touched again. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not the distance or the war or even the silence. It's the almost of it all. The ache of what might have been. The hall is full of music, soft lyres plucked with care, the rhythmic clapping of dancers, the hush of breath held for the next line of verse. You're at a noble's banquet somewhere in southern France, late 12th century, where the wine is heavy with spice and the air tastes faintly of honeyed meat. Everyone's dressed in silk, or at least pretending to be, and the star of the night isn't a lord or lady, it's a troubadour, and his tongue is going to get him killed. He stands at the far end of the room beside a blazing hearth, his cloak too worn for the company, his eyes flicking from shadow to chandelier. His name is Arnaud, and he's dangerous in the worst possible way. He tells the truth, wrapped in rhythm and rhyme. His voice is smooth, almost too casual, like someone who's never had to work hard to be heard. The crowd laughs, sighs, even gasps when he hits the right note. But the one person who doesn't laugh is the woman at the high table, Lady Juliet, wife to Count Emmerich. She doesn't smile, doesn't clap, but she watches. And when Arnaud sings the next verse, a line about a red-haired falcon too proud to perch but aching to be tamed, her hand trembles just slightly on the stem of her goblet. The thing is, troubadours were the rock stars of their day. Romantic, witty, poor, and perfectly scandalous. They travelled from court to court, carrying not just news and gossip, but coded love letters tucked into verse. Courtly love was a game everyone played, admiring from afar, writing secret poetry, exchanging glances behind tapestries. But some people, like Arnaud and Juliet, took it too far. They met a year ago, during a dull spring feast. Arnaud arrived with nothing but a lute and a smile. Juliet had been married off at 16 to a man twice her age, who mostly smelled like roasted garlic and ambition. Arnaud was nothing like her husband. He was lean, clever, and infuriatingly bold. He teased her with songs, dared her to respond, and when she did, he knew he was in trouble. Their affair lived in lyrics. Every new poem he performed was a coded message. She'd respond by choosing specific flowers to wear in her hair, or embroidering tiny symbols into her handkerchief. At night, she'd slip into the chapel and leave notes under the altar cloth. Once she smuggled him into the castle disguised as a mute harpist. He stayed 3 days. No one knew, or at least no one said anything. The problem was, Arnaud's fame grew. His song spread beyond the court, carried by other minstrels, copied in the margins of illuminated manuscripts, even recited at rival estates. and people started to notice the pattern. The red-haired lady, the hawk imagery, the unmistakable bitterness toward a powerful older lord. Count Emmerich wasn't a fool, a warlord maybe, a brutal politician definitely, but not a fool. He began watching Juliet more closely, limited her outings, fired her ladies-in-waiting and replaced them with spies. When Arno returned that winter for another festival, the Count greeted him with a little too much warmth, invited him to dine, poured his wine himself. That night, Arno performed a new song, one about a knight who dreams of a bird trapped in a gilded cage, singing not for joy but to warn the others. It was beautiful, haunting, and suicidal. By morning Arnaud was gone, not escorted, not banished, just gone. The official story is that he left at dawn heading east toward Toulouse, but the stablemaster swears no horses were taken. The kitchen girl says she saw blood on the Count's cloak the next day. And Juliet? She locked herself in her solar for a week and emerged changed. Pale, distant, her red hair hidden under veils for the rest of her life. But here's where it gets eerie. Decades later, a songbook was discovered in a remote abbey in the Pyrenees. It contained verses in Arnaud's handwriting, new ones, written in secret code. Some think he survived, escaped, that the Count didn't kill him, just maimed him. One theory suggests Juliet helped him flee, faking his death with the help of her old nursemaid and a few brave servants. Still no one knows for sure. The love story ended, or maybe it didn't. What remains is the poetry. Historical fact. Troubadours often walked the line between entertainment and espionage. Their verses could disguise everything from political messages to illicit affairs. Some were executed for treason, others simply vanished. Fringe fact. There's a folk tale in the region of Aquitaine about a red-haired ghost who appears on stormy nights singing songs no one remembers learning. Locals call her La Falconière, the falconer's lady. Debated idea. Were Arnaud's lyrics real confessions, or a long con? Some historians believe he crafted the entire love affair as part of his artistic persona, while others point to matching entries in Juliet's preserved journal that echo the songs line for line. You leave the hall as the last note fades, and the air seems too still afterward. It's easy to imagine Arnaud's voice lingering, like smoke. Easy to imagine Juliet at her window, even now, decades gone, mouthing the lyrics of a song that was meant only for her, a forbidden love made immortal, not by survival, but by story. You're standing just outside the walls of a crumbling abbey, the kind built on superstition and stone, where ivy swallows stained glass and every creak sounds like a secret begging to stay buried. The sun is sinking, bleeding orange through the trees, and somewhere inside a woman is committing the kind of sin that gets rewritten as sainthood if no one finds out. Her name is Mother Agnes, the abbess of St. Malory's, and tonight she's going to fake a divine vision so she can run off with the love of her life, a man who by all accounts should never have been in her orbit at all. Technically, she's not just any nun. Agnes was noble-born, educated, and terrifyingly intelligent. She could argue theology with bishops, speak 5 languages, and once memorized an entire book of psalms just to win a debate over penance. She was expected to rise in the church, maybe even become an advisor to the archbishop, but instead she fell in love, with someone she wasn't even supposed to speak to. His name was Elias ben Shimon, a Jewish scholar and physician from a town not far from the abbey's border. A man of science, not faith. Or at least not her faith. They met, as these stories tend to go, under strange circumstances. The abbey's livestock had fallen ill. Fevered cows, dying goats, chaos in the kitchen. The local priests were all prayer and no answers, so a desperate lay sister sought out Elias, who was known for using herbs and, frankly, heretical methods that involved washing one's hands and boiling water. He came reluctantly, more out of curiosity than duty, and found Agnes waiting for him in the stable courtyard, arms crossed, unimpressed. "You don't look like a healer," she said. "You don't look like an abbess," he replied. It was a terrible first impression, and exactly the kind that sticks. Over the next weeks, Elias returned, quietly to tend to the animals. But something shifted. Agnes stopped challenging his ideas, started asking about them, then asking about him, his family, his books. He began bringing her gifts, small things, a rare plant from the market, a page from a text she'd never read, and eventually letters, smuggled in through the kitchen maid and hidden inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. Their affair wasn't physical, at least not for a long time. It was intellectual, emotional, spiritual. a clashing of minds that sparked into something neither of them expected. Agnes had spent her entire life being told what to believe, what to feel. Elias never told her anything. He just asked, and she fell. But there was no world in which this ended well. He was Jewish, she was the abbess of a deeply Christian order. Interfaith relationships were not just frowned upon, they were criminal. Punishable by public shaming, lashes, even death. So they became masters of secrecy. He stopped coming in daylight. She invented illnesses for the cows. They carved a hole through the back of the chapel wall, hidden behind a fake shelf, where they'd pass notes, touch fingers, sometimes whisper. Then one day, Elias told her he was leaving. It wasn't by choice. Anti-Jewish sentiment had flared up again. Another wave of violence, sanctioned by a bishop looking for someone to blame for a bad harvest. His family was packing to flee. He wanted her to come with them. Disappear, start over. She said no, at least at first, then came the vision. On the first Sunday of Lent, Agnes entered the chapel mid-mass and collapsed, weeping. She claimed to have seen the Virgin Mary, who told her she must leave the abbey and carry God's mercy into the world beyond. It was theatrical, bold, and totally unbelievable. But here's the wild part. It worked. Some believed. Others were afraid to challenge her. She was, after all, powerful, respected, even feared. By midnight she was gone. She left behind everything, her books, her robes, her position. The next morning the sisters found a note on the altar, written in Latin and Hebrew, "There is no salvation in silence." What happened after? That's where the records fail. Some say she met Elias near the forest and crossed the border with him under cover of darkness. Others claim she died en route, or that she changed her name and lived out her days teaching medicine in a village no one remembers. But then there's this. In a manuscript archive in Provence, a text was discovered, a medical treatise written in an unusual blend of Latin, Hebrew and Occitan. It's signed by a woman called A. Ben Shimon. No one knows if it's truly her, but the handwriting matches a prayer book from St. Mallory's, and the first chapter is titled The Illness of Longing and the Cure of Truth. Historical fact. While nuns were expected to remain cloistered and celibate, there are documented cases of high-ranking abbesses who held more autonomy than many male clergy, especially when backed by noble blood. Fringe fact. In parts of southern France, particularly Occitania, there was a surprising amount of cross-religious scholarship during the early Middle Ages. Jewish and Christian scholars often studied side by side until the church cracked down. Debated idea. Did Agnes fake her vision out of faith or manipulation? Some scholars think she genuinely believed it. Others argue it was her only way out, her last power play in a life that never truly belonged to her. You walk now through the old abbey garden, where rosemary grows wild through cracked stone. The altar is long gone, but the shelf in the wall is still there, empty save for a small etching, 2 interwoven letters, A and E, cut deep into the stone, untouched by the weather or time. Whatever else happened, one thing's clear, she chose love, and whether it damned her or freed her, she never looked back. The monastery is eerily quiet at night, the kind of stillness that wraps around your ribs and makes your heartbeat sound like sin. You're walking the outer edge of the cloister wall, toes sinking into damp moss, when a soft rustle stops you cold. You wait, listen, then see him, slipping between shadows, robe hitched up, boots laced tight. Not exactly the image of monastic discipline. This is Brother Ewan, and tonight he's about to break every vow he's ever taken, not for freedom, not for gold, but for love. Love that has already crossed enemy lines, political boundaries, and the fine thread of his soul. He's a monk, yes, but not the old bent kind who mutters prayers and forgets where he left his ink pot. Ewan is young, sharp-eyed, with a face that doesn't quite fit his tonsure. He's been with the Benedictines since he was 13, brought in as a political favour from a local noble family who didn't have the gold for knighthood, but wanted the prestige of piety. He's obedient, mostly, keeps his head down, copies manuscripts like a machine. Until one winter, when a visiting delegation from the Eastern Territories arrives, half envoys, half prisoners of war, and Ewan meets Alexei. Alexei is nothing like the monks. Tall, dark-haired, unashamedly sarcastic, and technically a heretic. He comes from a splinter sect of Christianity that the church barely acknowledges, and yet here he is, being housed in the guest quarters with political awkwardness sizzling like oil over flame. The abbot says to keep him under watch, to convert him maybe. Ewan is assigned to deliver meals. It sounds simple, it isn't. Their conversations start cold, clipped, transactional. Alexei mocks the food, mocks the prayers, mocks the candles even. But Ewan doesn't report him, doesn't argue in either. He just listens. And one day, Alexei asks a question that cuts through everything. Do you even believe the things you write? Ewan doesn't answer. He doesn't sleep that night either. The next morning he brings extra bread. They sit, talk. Ewan learns that Alexei's father was a scholar, his mother a healer, that he had once studied Latin under threat of execution, that he carries 2 books sewn into the lining of his coat, one scripture, one poetry. And Ewan? He begins to forget why he ever came here, what obedience tasted like before Alexei's voice started showing up in his dreams. They fall slowly, like snow melt through stone, quietly, carefully, a brush of fingers during a shared scroll, a laugh too soft for anyone else to hear. And then, one night in the scriptorium, a kiss. It's clumsy and terrifying, and absolutely worth eternal damnation. But this monastery is no place for privacy. Whispers multiply. Someone spots Ewan sneaking into the guest wing too often. A novice sees him return with ink on his hands that doesn't match the day's assigned scrolls. Eventually the abbot intervenes. Ewan is summoned, told the guest will be transferred. That temptation must be removed, that any further fraternization will result in excommunication. Alexei is packed off with no warning, disappears before dawn. Ewan breaks. He stops writing, stops praying, starts spending his nights pacing the cloister walls, muttering to himself in Latin, and a language no one else recognizes. He begins hiding food, maps, even coins. The monks call it a crisis of faith. Then, 3 weeks later, he vanishes. The door to the monastery's rear gate is found unlocked. 1 horse missing. 1 copy of the Psalms left open on his desk. A feather pressed between the pages. There's no letter. Just a name scratched into the wood beneath his bed frame. Alexei. Did he find him? It's hard to say. Years later, a traveller claims to have met 2 ex-monks running a scriptorium in the borderlands. 1 French, 1 Slavic, both fluent in sarcasm and scripture. Another report speaks of an underground school where forbidden texts were taught, run by a pair of men who insisted truth was worth exile. Historical fact. Monasteries during wartime often held enemy diplomats, defectors, or prisoners for political purposes, under the guise of conversion opportunities. Fringe fact. In a recently discovered monastic record, an unnamed monk is accused of consorting with foreign heresy through nightly discourse. The accusation ends with the phrase, "and fled in the night, soul torn as parchment." Scholars believe it could reference Ewan. Debated idea. Was their love ever physical or purely spiritual? Some historians argue the church exaggerated the scandal to justify a political punishment. Others believe Ewan's disappearance had less to do with love and more to do with smuggling sacred texts, Alexei being the key to a rebel network. You stand now at the rear gate of the monastery, the iron latch still rusted from disuse. The moss is thick, the stones quiet, but a faint breeze hums through the trees like a memory. Somewhere beyond the woods, beyond the doctrine, beyond the war, 2 hearts may have found something freer than faith. Or maybe not. Maybe they burned out trying. But either way, they chose the fire. The house stands at the edge of the village like it knows it shouldn't be there. Too grand for its neighbours, too silent for its age, it leans into the hillside as though ashamed of its own presence. You arrive just as the sun sets behind the ridge, casting long shadows across its crooked windows. Inside, a candle flickers in the upper room. You hear a low laugh, then silence, then the creak of footsteps descending stairs. You're about to witness a scandal so expertly concealed it almost passed for charity. This is the home of Lady Sabine, widow of Sir Emeric de Calvet, who died during a border dispute with the neighbouring barony. One of those pointless little wars over who gets to tax sheep and water rights. Sabine was left with land, title, and enough gold to live out her days in quiet mourning. And for a while, that's exactly what she did. Attended mass, hosted feast days, and dutifully wore black. Then came Lucien. He wasn't a noble. He wasn't even close. He was a squire. Barely 20, fresh-faced, all limbs and eager silence. Sent to help manage her estate during harvest season. He was supposed to carry out orders, sharpen tools, maybe read her letters aloud if she grew tired. He did all of that and then some. He listened to her. No one had listened to her in years. Sabine was only 33, though people spoke of her like she'd already turned to dust. The court treated her like a relic, a woman embalmed in propriety, respectable but unreachable. Lucien didn't know better. He spoke to her plainly, asked her questions, teased her gently, and she, unused to anything resembling affection, began to thaw. At first it was small things, an extended moment in the garden, a shared piece of honeyed bread. Then one day she caught him reading poetry. Badly. She laughed, he blushed, and just like that the air between them thickened. It would have been easier if she'd been cruel, or if he'd been smarter, but they weren't. They were both too human, too lonely, and too curious about what would happen if they let the line blur. They started meeting in the orchard just before dawn, when the fog hung low, and the world felt like it belonged to no one. She'd bring tea, he'd bring questions. They never spoke of love at first. It was too absurd. He was young enough to be mistaken for her son. She was technically still in mourning, but then, one morning, she reached for his hand and didn't let go. That was the beginning. Soon the villagers began to whisper. The cook noticed how often Sabine asked for Lucien to be summoned to the manor. The steward caught them laughing behind the dovecote, and then there was the time they were seen returning from the woods, Sabine's hair unpinned, Lucien's tunic misfastened. But Sabine was smart and powerful. She preempted the scandal by announcing that Lucien had shown exemplary service and would be promoted to estate manager. She gave him a cottage on her land, paid him from her own purse, made their arrangement sound so official that it became impolite to question it. Still, the church took notice. An archdeacon visited under the pretense of blessing the estate. He asked Lucien too many questions, commented on Sabine's vibrant health and her continued worldly concerns. The message was clear. Widows were meant to retire from life, not entertain pretty squires in the orchard. And so one morning Lucien disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye, just a note left behind. You were the beginning of every poem I never wrote. Sabine did not weep publicly. She returned to Mass, hosted feast days again, and resumed her role as the embodiment of stately widowhood. But at night, she wandered the orchard in silence. And months later, when the apple blossoms returned, she was seen there in the early hours, holding a folded piece of parchment. No one dared ask what was written on it. Historical fact: medieval widows had more legal autonomy than unmarried women or wives. Many managed estates, represented themselves in court, and even remarried if it served political needs. But romantic autonomy? That was another story entirely. Fringe fact: in a nearby monastery archive there's a scribe's marginal note about a lady who tends her trees like they speak to her. It's dated 20 years after Sabine's time, and it describes her orchard exactly, rows of apples planted in the shape of a heart. Debated idea. Did Lucien leave voluntarily, or was he pressured out? Some speculate the archdeacon issued an unspoken threat: leave now or suffer consequences. Others suggest Sabine sent him away to protect him, having seen what happens when men reach too far above their station. You walk now through what was left of the orchard. The trees still bloom, though the manor is gone, swallowed by time and ivy. A single stone bench remains beneath the tallest tree. On its surface, faint and mossy, someone carved two initials, S and L, linked by the stem of a flower. Love here was never declared, never validated by vows or witnessed by priests, but it was real enough to plant itself in the soil, and sometimes that's all the proof anyone ever needs. The streets here smell like fire and iron, like burnt parchment and secrets pressed under centuries of soot. You're in a market town, not rich, not poor, but nervous, the kind of place that flinches when the wind changes direction. It's the early 14th century, and the church has begun whispering the word heresy with more enthusiasm than usual. People are burning things, old scrolls, strange herbs, entire people. You'd be wise not to stand out, which is exactly why the woman you're about to meet is in so much trouble. Her name is Breda, and she's a healer, or, depending on who's speaking, a witch. She lives just beyond the edge of town in a cottage half swallowed by vines and wild roses. She's known for her salves, her tinctures, and for her husband, who is almost never seen, because he's not her husband, not really, and technically he's not even from around here. His name is Theo, short for Theophilus. and he arrived in town 5 years ago with nothing but a satchel full of books and a face too angular for local comfort. Some said he was a runaway priest. Others guessed he was a disgraced alchemist. The truth was closer to both, and neither. He'd studied at the University of Bologna, been accused of tampering with the natural order, and fled north under the protection of someone very rich and very dead. He stumbled into Brida's life during a storm, collapsed outside her cottage, feverish, half-conscious, bleeding from a wound he refused to explain. She dragged him inside, patched him up, and told him he could stay 3 days. He never left. Their relationship unfolded like a ritual, slow, deliberate, full of things unspoken. She brewed teas while he muttered to himself in Latin. She talked to herbs like they had opinions. He wrote formulas that glowed faintly in the dark. They were opposites in every way, she earthy, intuitive, feared. He scholarly, logical, also feared, but for different reasons. They never married, but no one could tell. He built her a new herb drying rack. She carved a symbol over his door to keep illness away. At night, they worked side by side, him with his metals and arcane diagrams, her with roots and bones. Love wasn't the right word for it at first. It was more like mutual fascination. But fascination became comfort. Then something deeper. Something that curled into the corners of their home like smoke and stayed there. Unfortunately, the Inquisition also stay. It started subtly. A friar passing through, a neighbour's cow dying after eating tainted feed, a child recovering from fever not after church prayer, but after one of Brida's potions. Then someone mentioned the glimmering powder Theo had handed out during a winter cough, how it fizzed like stars and worked better than anything holy. That was enough. One night the church bells rang out of rhythm, a signal. Theo looked up from his notes and said, very calmly, "They've come." Brida didn't panic. She moved faster than he'd ever seen. She handed him a pouch, told him to take the path behind the cemetery, and not to stop until he reached the old Roman road. "Don't be noble," she'd said. "Be alive." He didn't argue. He kissed her once, the kind of kiss that doesn't ask for anything except remembrance, and then vanished into the trees. Instead, she turned every candle in the cottage upside down, burned a bundle of mugwort, and met the inquisitors at the gate with a pot of tea and a smile. They searched everything, found his notes, half-burned, found vials with odd colours, powders with strange smells. They called her a liar, a seductress, a tool of the devil. She laughed in their faces, claimed it was all her doing, that Theo was never real. They didn't know what to make of that. A woman confessing to more than she was accused of. Too chaotic to be useful, too clever to be easily broken. So they did what they often did, dragged her to the centre of town, tied her to a stake and left her in the rain for 3 days. But they didn't burn her. Maybe they feared her. Maybe the townsfolk whispered. Maybe in some twist of cowardice disguised as mercy they let her go. Broken but breathing. After that she vanished. Some say she walked into the forest and never returned. Others swear she was seen years later in a coastal village, selling dream tinctures and asking questions about stars. A few even claim she reunited with Theo, that they built a hidden workshop together, a place where science and magic stopped fighting and started kissing. Here's your historical fact. During the 14th century, women healers were often accused of witchcraft, especially if their knowledge threatened male-dominated medical institutions or the church's monopoly on suffering. Fringe fact, in a rare surviving text from a northern French archive, there's mention of an unnamed forest alchemist who created a tincture called the sleeping cygnes. No recipe survives, but it was said to ease pain and bring memories to life. Some believe it was Brida and Theo's invention. Debated idea. Was Theo real, or a cover? Some historians suggest Brida invented him as a scapegoat, a way to channel suspicion away from herself. Others argue that he was not only real, but pivotal in spreading early alchemical thought throughout northern Europe under assumed identities. You stand now at the edge of the forest, where the earth feels warmer than it should, and something metallic hums beneath your feet. Maybe it's a coincidence, or maybe, just beyond the trees, 2 brilliant minds are still working together, whispering secrets over bubbling flasks, their love surviving the only way it could, in the shadows. The city is dying. It's not a metaphor, not poetic exaggeration. People are actually dropping in the streets, their skin blackened, their breaths short, their cries echoing like cracked bells through shuttered alleyways. It's 1348, and the Black Death has gripped the city like a noose. You walk with your cloak pulled tight, eyes lowered. as you follow a pair of lovers into the one place no one is supposed to go, the Plague Gate. This is Verona, or what's left of it. The walled quarantine area outside the city is where they send the sick, or the suspected, or sometimes just the inconvenient. And that's where you find Matteo and Lucia, huddled under a makeshift canopy of rotted canvas and linen, holding hands like it's the only thing tethering them to life. Maybe it is. He's a gravedigger by trade. That used to be a joke once. Dirty, thankless work for a coin a day and no chance of upward mobility. But now it's a job more vital than royalty. Matteo was exempt from quarantine because the city needed bodies buried fast and no one else would touch them. So he stayed outside the gates, watched as the world crumbled. And then Lucia got sick. She wasn't anyone special, just a baker's daughter. She'd flirted with him once while buying firewood. He'd carried her basket when her arm was in a sling. Their love wasn't grand or poetic or even official. It was whispered at dusk, a shared apple behind the ovens, a touch of fingers through gloves. But when the coughing started and the fever rose, the city didn't care. Lucia was marked. Her family was forced to sign the declaration. She was dragged to the Plague Gate and thrown in with the others, left to rot, recover, or die. The gate shut behind her like the clang of fate. Most men would have walked away. Matteo didn't. 2 nights later, he forged a death certificate with his own name on it, bribed the gatekeeper with a bottle of sacramental wine, and walked in. No mask, no amulet, no plan, just love, stubborn and wild, dragging him into the grave with open eyes. He found her in a pile of rags, her skin hot, breath shallow. But she wasn't gone. Not yet. He built a shelter from scraps, found clean water from a forgotten cistern, and made her drink even when she screamed. He sang to her at night, soft songs in dialects no one remembered. He spoon-fed her broth stolen from a priest's abandoned pantry. She lived. Somehow, impossibly, she lived. For weeks they remained in the quarantine zone, pretending the world beyond the walls didn't exist. Other sick joined them, some left, some died. Matteo buried them gently, always with a prayer, even if he no longer believed in one god or 20. He believed only in Lucia's breath, steady and strong. Then one day the city opened the gates again, declared the plague had passed, as if it were a guest politely exiting a banquet. Lucia emerged thinner, but alive. Matteo should have followed, but he didn't. He turned and walked back into the zone. No one ever saw him again. That's the mystery. Some say he contracted the sickness too late and chose to die where he belonged. Others believe he felt more at home among the lost than the saved. A fringe theory suggests he was protecting someone, a group of unregistered survivors the city would have burned out of fear. But Lucia survived. She returned to her father's shop, never married, and every year on the same day she walked to the wall and left a single apple at the base of the Plague Gate. No note, no words, just the fruit they once shared when life was ordinary still and love wasn't lethal. Historical fact: during the Black Death, quarantine zones were enforced with brutal efficiency. Those inside were usually left without resources, and re-entry into the city was often forbidden without explicit church clearance. Fringe fact: a local legend from Verona tells of a gravedigger turned angel who guided the sick to safety using underground tunnels and coded symbols. Some believe Matteo became that figure, living in the shadows, saving quietly. Debated idea: did Lucia's recovery prove the plague could be survived through care and love, or was she simply lucky? Some early proto-medical theorists cited her story in arguments for more humane treatment of the sick, while church officials buried the tale for fear it undermined divine punishment doctrine. You stand now near the gate, though the wall has long since crumbled. There's nothing here but grass and stone, yet the air still tastes like grief and grit. If you look closely, you'll find it. One last apple tree, gnarled and bent but alive, blooming in spring with pale pink blossoms. It shouldn't be growing here, and yet it is, just like she did. The castle sits like a secret on the edge of a cliff, its towers swallowed by fog, its gates rusted shut from decades of disuse. You walk the crumbling path as gulls circle above and waves crash below, and you can't shake the feeling that something tragic happened here. Something too intimate for war, and too quiet for legend. This is the story of 2 people born on opposite sides of the royal bloodline, each hidden for different reasons, and how their lives twisted into one another like ivy around stone. He's called Adric, though no one ever says it too loudly. The king's bastard. A fact not carved into stone but whispered behind goblets, passed like contraband between servants. His mother was a lady-in-waiting, beautiful and naive, who vanished from court soon after the child was born. Adric was raised not as a prince but as a fostered orphan, tucked away in the outer ring of the court with just enough gold to keep questions from being asked, and just enough coldness to ensure he understood what he wasn't. She, on the other hand, was the kingdom's hope. Her name was Elise, and she was cloistered from birth. An heiress to a rival house the king had absorbed through marriage, technically of royal blood but held in a tower for her protection, which is to say the king feared her inheritance might be weaponized against him. She lived her entire childhood behind high walls, with tutors and prayers and dreams so controlled they barely counted as dreams at all. Their first meeting happened by accident. Adric had been sent to the castle's edge as punishment, caught teaching a page how to sword fight improperly. Elise had snuck out of her chamber, disguised in a servant's cloak, trying to find a view of the sea. They collided in a hallway neither was supposed to be in. She dropped her candle. He caught her wrist, and for a moment, neither of them knew how to lie. From that point on, they lived for stolen time. Midnight chess games in the chapel, Latin lessons swapped under the guise of correctional reading, walks in the garden under thick hoods, heads bowed as if in prayer. They never kissed. Not at first. They didn't have to. They existed in a state of yearning so fierce the air between them crackled. It was dangerous, of course. Elise was meant for alliance, a chess piece on the political board, and Adric, a ghost with no place, tolerated but never trusted. Their affection was not just inconvenient, it was treasonous. But they didn't stop. They began passing letters hidden in the spines of books. Adric carved tiny messages into the wooden handles of serving trays. Elise embroidered symbols into her sleeves, stars, moons, runes only he could recognize. When the castle guards grew suspicious, they communicated through a series of coded bells rung from the chapel tower. And then came the plan. It was madness, really. They wanted to run, disappear into the northern marshlands where no one cared about lineage or claims. They had a contact, a former knight-turned-smuggler, loyal to no one, and always hungry for gold. The date was set, the window would be unlatched, the horse would be waiting at the back gate. But on the night of their escape, Elise didn't come. Adric waited, long past midnight, long after the moon had dipped behind clouds and the night had gone still. When he finally snuck back into the castle, he found her tower door wide open and her chambers empty. No struggle, no blood, just gone. He searched. For days, weeks. Pretended to be a servant, a scholar, even a thief, nothing. Eventually he returned to court, changed and silent. He no longer tried to fight for attention or rank or legitimacy. He became invisible again. Not because he had to, because he wanted to be. But then, years later, a letter arrived. Slipped into the sleeve of a travelling bard. The handwriting was hers. It said only, "I'm safe. I chose a different freedom. Remember me when the stars bend low." The theories, endless. Some believe Elise was caught before she could flee and sent to a convent under a false name. Others think she changed her mind, that she realised love could not outpace war. A few romantic souls suggest she faked her own disappearance to protect Adric, allowing him to survive unpunished. And what of him? Adric never married, never claimed land. But he funded the building of a library on the northern coast, far from the capital. In its centre stands a statue, unlabelled, of a young woman gazing out to sea. Historical fact. Many illegitimate children of kings were raised at court but kept just outside the line of succession. They were often used for diplomacy but rarely trusted with power. Fringe fact. In a forgotten family chapel along the western cliffs, there is a single stained glass panel showing a red-haired woman holding a book with a star-shaped clasp. The family has no record of commissioning it, and its symbolism doesn't match any saint. Debated idea. Was Elise's disappearance truly a choice? Some records suggest foul play. Others, edited by later royal historians, claim she was lost to illness, though no death certificate was ever produced. Now, standing on the cliff's edge beside the empty shell of the castle, you watch the tide roll in. There's a star carved into the stone railing, weather-worn, faint but still visible. A message left behind, not of victory or tragedy but of what could have been. A memory etched into the stone of the only place they were ever free. The sun is setting over the open fields, turning the grass to fire, and the dust to gold. You walk along the edge of a country road, the kind that once saw armies march but now just carries sheep and secrets. Off in the distance you spot a manor house, elegant but exhausted, as if it survived too many winters and not enough love. But you're not headed for the manor, you're headed for the stables. That's where the real story lives. That's where a duchess once fell in love with a man who wasn't supposed to exist in her world at all. His name was Thomas, a horse thief, and not the charming misunderstood kind either. He stole horses, for money, for spite, for the sheer thrill of outsmarting noblemen who locked up everything but their pride. He wasn't subtle about it. He'd been caught twice before, yet escaped both times. No one quite knew how. One baron claimed Thomas had made a deal with the devil. Another swore the man vanished into smoke. Neither was true, of course. Thomas just knew how to run. He wasn't planning on stopping at the Duchy of Lavon. But the horse there, that horse, was worth a fortune. A black destrier, powerful, graceful, with bloodlines traced back to the Crusades. The perfect prize. He scaled the stable walls by moonlight, opened the gate with fingers that moved like poetry, and nearly got away. But he didn't account for her, Isabel de Lavon, the Duchess, recently widowed, ridiculously wealthy, and widely considered untouchable. She wasn't supposed to be in the stables that night, but sleep had been evading her lately, and she'd come to walk among the horses as a kind of private rebellion. Instead, she caught him, quite literally, with a rope around a stallion's neck and a face that said, "I know this looks bad." She could have screamed, could have called the guards. Instead she said, "If you're going to steal my horse, at least saddle it properly." And then she sat on a hay bale and watched as he did just that. What followed was not a chase, not an arrest, but a conversation about horses, about freedom, about what it feels like to walk a line so thin it disappears under your feet. Thomas left without the horse that night, left with something else instead, curiosity. And Isabel, she didn't sleep that night either. He came back, of course, not to steal, just to talk. Then again, a week later. Then again. She started leaving the stable door unlatched. Not an invitation, but not exactly a barrier either. They were opposites in every way. He was coarse, with dirt under his nails and stories that sounded suspiciously like lies. She was elegant, restrained, with eyes that had learned how to see without being seen, and yet they spoke the same secret language. Restlessness. Neither of them belonged where they were. Eventually, they became more than conversation. It happened in the hayloft one stormy night, with the rain hammering on the roof and the smell of leather and damp wood wrapping around them. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't planned. It was raw, inevitable, the kind of thing that shakes the bones of your life loose. They kept it going longer than they should have. Weeks, then months. She kept her reputation polished like silver, smiling through court dinners, issuing orders with regal precision. Meanwhile, Thomas became a shadow, appearing only in the quiet hours, vanishing before sunrise. He left her wildflowers. She left him bread wrapped in silk. But all games end eventually. One night a stable boy saw them. Said nothing at first, but rumours travel like rats. Within a week, the Duchess's steward was asking questions. Within 2, the local magistrate received an anonymous report, and Thomas was captured trying to leave the duchy. No trial, no chance, just a cell. Isabel visited once, in secret. He told her to forget him. She told him to stop telling her what to do. The next morning he was gone. The official record says he escaped. Slipped his bonds, fled into the woods. But the door to his cell was found wide open. The key, missing. And the Duchess? No one saw her for 3 days. She emerged changed, colder. She took to riding alone, often to the edges of her lands where the road turned to wilderness. She never remarried, never spoke of Thomas again. But once a year, on the eve of that stormy anniversary, she left a black ribbon tied to the stable gate. No one knew why. Historical fact, nobility caught consorting with common criminals, especially thieves, could face everything from exile to church intervention. Widows, despite having some power, were constantly watched for signs of moral failing. Fringe fact. In a set of old court ledgers from Lavon, there's a single blank entry where a prisoner's name and crime should be. It's dated the week Thomas was caught. A different hand added, "Debt settled, silence due." Debated idea. Did Isabel free him? Some say she bribed the guards and helped him escape. Others claim she let him hang but buried the truth in protocol. A few think they both fled together, leaving decoys behind. One ballad speaks of a lady and a thief who sailed west on a stolen horse barge. You stand now by the stable ruins. The wood is soft with rot. The gate still holds one rusted hinge, and there, barely clinging to it, is a scrap of black ribbon, frayed, forgotten, but still there, like love that never asked permission and never really left. The first thing you notice is the silence. Not peaceful, not serene, heavy like a secret being held at knife point. You're standing outside a stone tower that leans slightly to one side, pressed into the edge of a crumbling fortress. The smell of smoke lingers in the air, even though the fire's long been out. Inside, someone once burned, not from kindling, but from fear, and from love that no one dared speak of. Her name was Elellanena, and for most of her life she was called a witch, but that's not how her story starts. Her story starts with a guard named Emmerich, and a promise no one expected him to keep. Elellanena lived in the village below the fortress. She was odd, sure, knew too many things, spent too much time in the woods, spoke too plainly about things that made men nervous. She had a knack for healing, for predicting weather, for coaxing a field of limp barley back to life with herbs and rituals that didn't sound entirely like prayers. And that, of course, made her dangerous. The church never liked women who fixed things without permission. Emmerich was a castle guard. Not important, not particularly bright, but solid and kind. He wasn't supposed to speak to her, but during a storm one winter, when the village flooded and people needed help getting to high ground, she guided him and 2 children across the river with a rope and a prayer. He never forgot that. Afterward, he'd walk her home sometimes, brought her salted pork from the castle kitchens. Once, when she was sick, he stole her a wool blanket from the barracks. They didn't speak of love. They barely touched. But something deep bloomed between them. A quiet, wordless knowing. She'd glance at him, and his shoulders would drop. He'd stand near to her and feel like his skin fit right again. When she asked about his scars, he didn't flinch. When he asked about her loneliness, she didn't lie. Then came the famine. The crops failed for the 2nd year in a row. People started dying. The church blamed sin. The nobles blamed the peasants. The peasants blamed someone they'd always been nervous about. Elellanena. At first it was small. A chicken nailed to her door. A cursed sigil carved into the earth outside her cottage. Emmerich tried to protect her, but there were limits. He was a guard, not a knight. And she was now a target. One night, a child died after drinking spoiled milk. The parents claimed Elellanena had cursed their cow. No one asked how she could have done that from 3 miles away. The facts didn't matter. The fear did. They came for her at dawn. Emmerich was on duty. He saw them drag her from her bed, her hands bound, her face bloodied. He didn't stop them, not then. The captain ordered it, and he obeyed. Like always. She was taken to the tower. They didn't burn her immediately. That would have been too clean. Instead, they questioned her for days, accused her of seduction, of dealing with demons, of poisoning wells. She said nothing, not to them, but Emmerich visited in the dead of night. Snuck in through the servants' stairwell, sat with her silent. She held his hand even while hers trembled. He told her he'd find a way, that he wouldn't let them kill her. But time ran out. The bishop arrived, declared her guilty without trial, ordered her to be burned at the next market day, for maximum effect. That night, Emmerich vanished. They assumed he ran, abandoned his post. The guards mocked him. Coward, they said. Couldn't watch his witch burn. And yet the morning of her execution, Elellanena was gone. The cell was locked from the outside, the iron bars intact. The only thing out of place? A rope hanging from the tower window and a trail of footprints leading into the woods. The manhunt lasted 3 days. They never found them. Not a trace, not a scarf, not a strand of hair. But here's the thing. Years later, in a fishing village 200 miles away, there were rumours. A healer who never charged. A man who limped but smiled like someone who'd escaped the noose. They lived in a small cottage by the sea with herbs drying from the rafters and a garden that bloomed even in the dead of winter. Historical fact. Accusations of witchcraft spiked during times of famine and plague, especially against women who had knowledge of medicine, herbs, or midwifery. Trials were often held without evidence. Fringe fact. In a preserved map of the region from 1382, a tower is marked with a single note, "She left on windless night." There's no mention of a fire, no name, Just that line in faded ink. Debated idea. Did Emmerich rescue Elena, or did someone else? A few scholars claim her escape was orchestrated by other women in the village who knew they might be next. Some say it was magic. Others insist the rope and the footprints were planted as a decoy, and that she was executed after all, quietly, to avoid further unrest. You step now into the old tower. The air is cool, the stone is cracked, but the cell door is still intact. If you run your hand along the wood, you'll find it, carved small and deep into the sill. We stayed alive, we stayed free. No initials, just that. And in the corner of the room where no light reaches, a tuft of herbs still grows from the stone floor. Lavender, for healing, for memory, for love that said, "We don't owe anyone our ruin." It begins with a mask. Not the cloth kind used to keep out dust, and not the medical ones you've seen in plague years. No, this one is pure indulgence. Gold leaf, painted feathers, tiny bells that chime if you laugh too hard. You're standing in the torchlit courtyard of a medieval masquerade ball, held once a year at Castle Montreux, a place so stuffed with aristocracy and secrets it practically wheezes under the weight. It's the sort of place where everyone knows everyone's sins but agrees not to mention them, as long as the wine keeps flowing and the fiddlers keep playing. Tonight is the Feast of St. Eustace, which is ironic because he's the patron saint of lost causes. A good omen if you're about to fall in love with someone you absolutely should not. He's dressed in a velvet doublet, black and red, with a fox mask trimmed in silver. You spot him across the ballroom and feel it instantly, the way the air knots around him. He's not supposed to be here. You don't recognise his posture. He doesn't bow like the others, doesn't hover near anyone. He leans on the banister like he owns gravity, and when he finally turns to face you, it's like he already knows everything about you that you'd never say out loud. You're here as a guest of the Countess, your cousin through marriage. Your real job is to act dignified and quiet and maybe charm a dull baron into offering your family an alliance. Instead, you're standing in front of a stranger with a glint in his eye and a secret behind his lips. "Should I know who you are?" you ask. He bows slightly. "I'm counting on the fact that you don't." You dance, once. Then again, the music changes, the candles burn lower. You don't ask names. You trade riddles, trivia, stories so ridiculous they must be true. The fox mask tilts when he smiles. You ask him where he's from, he says, "Far enough away that I can say anything tonight and not be lying." Later, in the garden, he kisses you behind a hedge of roses. It's the kind of kiss that edits your entire memory, makes you question why you ever let anyone else kiss you at all. But things get weird fast. The next day you wake in your chamber to the sound of guards on the stairs. A woman is crying, someone's shouting about theft, about deceit, about betrayal of trust. The fox-masked man, he's gone. Turns out he wasn't a noble, not even a merchant. He was a disgraced knight, Sir Corvin of Maron, who lost his title for reasons that were never made public. Rumours suggest treason or heresy or some kind of romance scandal involving the wrong duchess and a very irate bishop. What's more, he wasn't invited to the masquerade. He broke in. But here's the part no one tells you. He left a letter. For you. Folded inside your left-hand glove, discovered days later when you're packing to leave. It reads, "You made the night feel like it was meant to happen. I'm sorry the morning had to arrive. If you ever want to know who I really am, follow the fox's path." That phrase, the fox's path, turns out to be a reference to a hunting trail on the edge of the duchy, an old smuggler's route used centuries ago. You go, of course you do. There, tucked inside a hollow tree, you find another note, and another. Over the next weeks, it becomes a game, a courtship, a breadcrumb trail of letters and poems and half-truths scattered across the countryside. He never shows himself, but he's always just ahead of you. Watching, writing, waiting, you fall in love again, not with his face or his kiss, but with the chase, the devotion, the effort. You become something mythic. Then one day the letters stop. You wait. Nothing. A week passes, then a month. Eventually you hear it from a travelling merchant. A man matching his description was caught crossing a border with forged documents, taken to the capital, imprisoned. No trial yet. Likely won't be one. Just a name in a ledger and a cell in the dark. You go to the city, you bribe a clerk, a priest, a guard. Eventually, you find the prison. Speak to no one. slip a folded note through a crack in the wall. You wait. The next day the guard finds it gone. The day after that the cell is empty. Escape? Execution? No one knows. You return to Castle Montois the next year for the Feast of St. Eustace. It's quieter now, fewer masks, less dancing, but in the garden near the rose hedge you find a fresh fox mask nailed gently to the tree. Historical fact: masquerade balls did occur in medieval courts, though not as elaborate as their Renaissance counterparts. They often served as political distractions or traps. Fringe fact: in a noblewoman's personal diary from the region, there are entries describing a masked affair with a man she called Reynard, the French name for a fox. The name appears more than 20 times, always in red ink. Debated idea: was Corvin real, or a literary fantasy stitched into real documents by a lonely noblewoman desperate for a story? Some scholars believe the tale is too detailed to be fiction. Others argue it was crafted as a symbolic allegory for forbidden desire, especially desire not rooted in marriage or wealth. You sit now in the rose garden, fingers tracing the outline of that mask. It's faded, yes, a little rain-warped, but intact, like the memory of one perfect night where nothing made sense, and that was the point. Where love wore a costume, told lies, and still felt more real than anything with a crown or a title. The sea smells like rust and gunpowder, thick in your throat as you walk along the edge of a coastal monastery. The air carries salt and silence, and everything here feels just a little off, as if the cliffs themselves are keeping a secret. It's the year 1312 and the world is shifting beneath everyone's feet. The Pope has grown suspicious of nearly everything, including the monks at this place. But the real secret of St. Oran's Abbey isn't buried in some forbidden scroll or relic hidden under floorboards. No, it's much simpler. The abbot's daughter has fallen in love with a pirate. She shouldn't even exist, of course. The abbot, Father Hadrian, took his vows 25 years ago. But that didn't stop him from fathering a child in his reckless youth. Long before his hair turned white and his sermons turned cold, her name is Talia. Technically, she's listed in the monastery's records as companion and ward. The brothers whisper, the villagers pretend. And Talia, sharp-eyed and stubborn, pretends right back. She spends her days cataloguing relics and repairing manuscripts. Dusty, respectable work. But her heart belongs to the sea. Her favourite place is the watchtower above the cliffs, where she reads and sketches ships in the margins of psalms. The monks think she's pious. What they don't know is that she's been tracking one particular ship for over a year. It started with a storm. A merchant vessel crashed just off the rocks, shattering like a wine cup against the reef. Only a few survived, and among them was a man with silver earrings and an accent that made Latin sound like a love song. His name was Soren, though he gave her a dozen others just for fun. Rook, Ash, sometimes Your Grace if he was feeling cheeky. He wasn't a merchant, not really. His cargo was stolen, his crew lawless, and his purpose mostly improvised. But when he looked at Talia, it wasn't with greed or game, it was with wonder. They met in secret, first beneath the bell tower, then in the caves carved into the cliffs. She brought him bandages and salt pork. He brought her stories, maps, trinkets from cities she'd never see. And slowly, impossibly, they fell into something dangerous. It wasn't just that he was a pirate, it was that he was free. Everything Talia had been taught to fear, impulse, disobedience, desire, he embodied, and it didn't destroy him. It made him more alive than anyone she'd ever met, cloaked in robes and Latin. They talked of escape, of finding a cove somewhere the monks couldn't reach. He promised her a ship with white sails and no saints carved into the bow. She promised him nothing, just stayed. But her eyes said everything. They might have made it too, if not for the ledger. One of the brothers, a humourless man with a spine like a sword, discovered it. A book of monastery supplies had been tampered with, food missing, medical rations low, a stash of tallow candles entirely gone. Talia tried to deny it, but the brother found the drawings. Her sketches of the ship, of Soren, of herself with the wind in her hair and the world ahead. The abbot didn't speak when she was brought before him. He simply looked at her, like he'd been robbed of something he hadn't even known he still cared about. "Is it true?" he asked. She didn't lie. They locked her in the reliquary chamber beneath the abbey. No windows, no books, just saints' bones, and the knowledge that her love would either save her or leave her there to rot. 3 nights passed, then 4. Then on the 5th the monastery caught fire. The blaze was swift and surgical, just the West Wing storage and archives, enough to create chaos, enough to make every monk run outside and turn their backs for a single crucial moment. When they returned, the reliquary was empty. No one could explain it. The door hadn't been broken, the hinges were still sealed, just gone. Some believe Soren did it, used the fire as a distraction. Others say Talia started the fire herself. A few monks whispered that it was divine punishment for the abbot's sin, that both father and daughter were damned. But weeks later, a fishing vessel docked further down the coast, its crew speaking of a ship they'd seen slipping past the horizon. White sails, no flag, and a woman at the helm, hair like seaweed and a sword at her hip. Historical fact: while rare, monasteries on the coast were sometimes raided or taxed by passing pirates, who would occasionally spare lives in exchange for information or bribes. Monasteries also kept meticulous ledgers. Every missing item meant suspicion. Fringe fact, Gin. A series of carvings found inside a sea cave near the old abbey ruins depict a ship with a fox at the prow and a woman's name, Talia, beneath it. No ship registry ever included a vessel by that name. Debated idea. Was the fire accidental or staged? Did Soren infiltrate the monastery in disguise? Some scholars suggest he posed as a travelling monk during the days leading up to the escape. Others say the fire was divine intervention, a recurring theme in the local folklore. You stand now where the bell tower once cast its shadow over the sea. The stones are scattered, but one remains intact. On its side, carved deep with a sailor's hand, are 4 words: wind, flame, and freedom. Whether they lived happily ever after, or simply burned brighter than most for a single forbidden moment, depends on who's telling the tale. But either way, she got her ship, and he got his compass. The forest is darker than it usually would be, not because of the trees. They're tall, yes, ancient even, but it's something else, something in the way the wind moves like breath, how every branch seems to listen. You step carefully over moss-covered roots, into a grove where 2 families once spilled blood over land, pride, and the usual nonsense nobility invented to justify centuries of misery. And in the middle of it all, under this canopy of gloom and green, 2 teenagers, barely adults, not even married off yet, decided they weren't interested in carrying their parents' hatred. Their names were Sylvan and Miran. He was the son of House Valmont, proud lords of the Eastern Glens. She belonged to House Darcy, who ruled the Riverlands just west. Their feud was older than the road between them. Generations of betrayal, duels, sabotage. The land between the 2 keeps was left wild, deliberately unclaimed. A neutral zone they called the No Man's Grove. It was cursed, according to both families. Off limits, which of course made it the most interesting place in the world. They met by accident. Miran had been chasing a lost hawk through the trees, her riding cloak torn and her boots caked in mud. Sylvan had wandered too far from his hunting party, trying to get away from his cousin's bragging. They nearly collided near a mossy creek, both drawing blades without hesitation, instinct trained into them like breath. But neither struck. Not then. They stared, blinked, lowered their weapons, then Miran muttered, "Well, this is awkward," and Sylvan laughed. That's how it began. What followed was a secret truce, a shared space carved into enemy land. They started meeting there regularly, sometimes pretending to hunt, sometimes pretending to prey. They brought each other things: a book of poems, a slingshot made from willow, a ribbon, an apple. At first, they barely touched. They talked, argued about history, challenged each other to tree-climbing contests, invented fake royal lineages to make each other laugh. And then, one late summer evening, Sylvan kissed her. It wasn't dramatic, just a kiss by the stream, but it cracked something open. After that, they were inseparable. Their families didn't know, or didn't want to know, but the servants noticed the changes. Miran stopped wearing her mother's colours. Sylvan returned from the woods with leaf marks on his throat. Someone found a scarf that didn't belong to either household and buried it before the steward could ask questions. They made a pact, an actual one, with cut palms and blood smeared on stone. If their families tried to marry them off, they'd run, disappear. There were places they'd heard where family names meant nothing, where you could be just yourself, not a pawn, not a title. The day the betrothal letter came, it was worse than they imagined. Miran was to marry the heir of a coastal duchy, some distant cousin of the Queen. Political gold, irrefutable. Sylvan was ordered to pledge fealty to a regional bishop in return for land. They met in the grove the same night, both furious, both shaking. They didn't cry, they didn't plead, they just held each other and said, "Let's go." And they did. At least that's what the stories say. The next morning both were gone. Their chambers undisturbed, windows unlatched, horses missing, no signs of struggle. Their families, shocked, humiliated, immediately blamed each other. War nearly broke out, but cooler heads prevailed. Eventually a joint investigation was launched. The No Man's Grove was torn apart, searched, trampled. They found blood on a stone, a torn bit of fabric, but no bodies, no tracks, nothing. The official story became tragedy. They must have died, the scribes wrote, starved or mauled by wolves, or swept into the river. Their names were engraved on memorial stones in their family chapels. A sad tale, a cautionary one. But a year later, a merchant passing through a southern valley told a strange story of two young farmers who arrived with no parents, no names, but eyes that watched everything and a smile that never quite faded. A couple who kept to themselves but always made room at their hearth for travellers, who grew nothing but roses and wheat, and who every spring lit a small fire in the woods and danced around it in silence. Historical fact, inter-family rivalries in medieval Europe often lasted generations, usually over land, livestock, or broken betrothals. Some conflicts were so old that no one remembered how they'd started, only that they must continue. Fringe fact, in a forgotten almanac written by a travelling monk, there's a mention of a ghost wedding performed in a clearing where the moss grows in the shape of hearts. No names are given, but the date matches the night Mairen and Sylvan disappeared. Debated idea. Did they die in the grove or escape through it? One theory suggests a servant helped smuggle them south using trade caravans. Another insists the blood found on the stone was animal, planted to fake a tragic end. A few grim voices claim the families knew exactly what happened, and buried them quietly to avoid scandal. You walk now through the edge of the forest, where moss still climbs trees like ivy, and this creek babbles like it remembers everything. If you look closely, you'll find it. 2 stone hearts, half buried, overgrown but unmistakably carved by hand. No names, just a promise etched deep, no more blood. Whether they vanished or lived in secret, their love rewrote something ancient, turned a battlefield into a sanctuary, made peace in a place where it was never allowed. The court is stifling tonight. Too many candles, too much perfume, too much forced laughter to echoing off walls gilded with saints and sins alike. You linger near a marble column, watching the swirl of silk skirts and jewelled smiles, all masking sharp intentions. This is the palace of Queen Aveline of Ormond, beloved by poets and feared by politicians. They call her the Pearl Lioness, graceful, radiant, and absolutely untouchable. But in the far corner of the ballroom, half shadowed by velvet drapes, she's laughing in a way that doesn't fit her public legend. And the woman making her laugh isn't a court jester, or a duchess, or a visiting queen. She's a lady-in-waiting, and her name is Thera. Thera isn't beautiful in the way the court prefers. She's quiet, lean, more wolf than swan. She wears no rouge and never speaks unless spoken to, unless the queen's around. Then her words sharpen, fast and clever. Everyone notices, of course. Aveline's eyes linger longer than they should. Thera never bows too low. Their conversations end with half smiles, unspoken jokes. And beneath all that ceremony, something dangerous is blooming. They met years ago, when Aveline was still a princess and Thera was assigned to serve her. Back then, Aveline was more woman than monarch, still learning how to wield charm as a weapon, still unsure if love was a weakness or a luxury. Thera, born to a minor house, had no illusions. Her job was survival. But something about the princess disarmed her, something lonely behind the laughter. They became confidants, then companions, then something more. It happened in increments, a touch on the hand that lasted too long, a look exchanged across a crowded room, a letter slipped under a door unsigned but unmistakable, a stolen hour in the conservatory after midnight. They knew the risks, knew what it meant for a queen to favour another woman in a world built entirely around lineage and legacy. And then Aveline was crowned. Overnight, everything changed. She was no longer a woman, they made her into an idea, a symbol. Her marriage was arranged to a foreign prince within weeks of the coronation. Aveline didn't cry, didn't protest, But the day the marriage contract was signed, Thera found a rose pressed between the pages of her prayer book, soaked in wine, as if someone had tried to drink away the pain and failed. The wedding came and went like a storm no one could outrun. The prince was fine, polite, dull, and soon absent, off to war, or pretending to be. Everyone pretended things were normal, but behind closed doors the queen and her lady-in-waiting fell back into old habits. Quiet glances, locked doors, nights that felt like borrowed time. Eventually they were caught. It wasn't scandal that did it. It was politics. A rival advisor saw too much, passed it on to a bishop, and soon Aveline faced a choice: loyalty or survival. If she denied the accusations, Thera would be arrested. If she confessed, she'd be deposed. The court waited to see what kind of queen she truly was. Here's where the story fractures. The official record says Thera was dismissed, quietly, given a modest estate in the countryside for her service. Aveline never spoke of her again, and the court applauded the queen's prudence. The prince returned briefly. Aveline smiled, played the role. But a few years later, a courier arrived at the palace with a painting. No signature, no explanation, just a landscape of a quiet garden near the sea. And in the background, two women walking hand in hand, one with a crown in her satchel, the other with a wolf pendant around her neck. Historical fact, same-sex relationships between women were often ignored in official medieval records, either because they were seen as harmless, or because they posed too great a threat to heteronormative structures if acknowledged. Fringe fact, an obscure noblewoman's diary from the Ormont court references Her Majesty's Midnight Companion, and details a private chamber called the Velvet Cloister, which no one but the Queen entered after dark. Debated idea, was Thera truly sent away? Some believe she remained at court under a false identity, serving as a spy, master, or a private advisor. Others suggest she fled across the sea and the Queen funded her escape. A few romantic scholars believe they reunited years later, when Aveline fell ill and retreated to a coastal estate to convalesce. You walk now through the ruins of that estate. Time has chewed away the walls, but the garden remains, tangled, wild, but oddly intentional. Roses grow beside foxglove. A bench faces the sea, and carved into its back, nearly faded to nothing, is a single line in old Ormontian script: what is crowned can also kneel. Whether they loved in secret for years or lived only in that memory they made of each other, you can still feel it here, something quiet and steady and defiant. A love that didn't ask permission, a love that never truly left. You hear the oath before you see him, soft and steady, muttered like a prayer into the still morning air. You're standing in a field outside a small hilltop chapel, dew soaking through your boots, birds watching from the hedgerows as if they too know something sacred is happening. At the centre of the field is a man on one knee, his sword point down in the grass, his hands wrapped in a strip of cloth that once belonged to someone he shouldn't have loved. This is Sir Cedric, once a knight of the Silver Order, now a man who's taken a vow of silence to atone for a betrayal no one ever truly understood. The silence wasn't imposed, it was chosen. Years ago, he was one of the most beloved knights in the realm. He fought with grace, prayed with discipline, and looked annoyingly perfect in every tapestry. Courtiers adored him, nobles praised him, and even the king called him the Sword of Virtue. Then he vanished for 2 months during the spring campaign, returned thinner, quieter, refused to say where he'd been. His comrades assumed battle trauma, maybe a personal crisis. The truth was far more dangerous. During those missing weeks, Cedric had broken every vow he swore to uphold, and it had started with a mistake. He'd been separated from his unit during a skirmish and took shelter in a ruined chapel in the Eastern Highlands. Injured, fevered, barely able to lift his sword. That's where she found him. Martyr. A healer, but not one approved by the church. She wore bone charms, whispered strange blessings, and mixed her potions by moonlight. She wasn't a witch exactly, but close enough that if anyone found her, she'd be burned without trial. At first, Cedric feared her. Then he argued with her. Then he listened. Then finally, he watched her hands as she mixed herbs, and something inside him cracked. He stayed longer than he should have. His wounds healed, but he didn't leave. They talked about philosophy, about death, about God and what he actually wanted. Marta challenged him in ways his fellow knights never could. She questioned his blind loyalty, called his order a house of mirrors, and forced him to see how much of his life was performance. And yet she never once asked him to give it up. The love that bloomed between them was quiet, unhurried, a slow-burning fire that never demanded proof. There were no grand gestures, no declarations, just the rhythm of shared mornings and the silence of understanding. When they finally made love, it wasn't desperate or forbidden, it was inevitable, like rain on dry soil. But 2 weeks later, soldiers came looking. They found only Marta. Cedric had gone to gather firewood. When he returned, the chapel was ash. They said she resisted arrest, that she attacked a knight, that it was self-defence. Cedric's commander told him all of this while handing him a charred scrap of her tunic. Cedric said nothing. He took the cloth, wrapped it around his hands, and fell to his knees. From that day forward, he stopped speaking, refused orders, abandoned titles, renounced his claim to knighthood. He wandered from village to village, sword still sheathed at his hip, never drawn. He helped rebuild homes, dug graves, listened to confessions no priest wanted to hear. People started calling him the Silent Blade. Some mocked him, others feared him. A few even believed he'd gone mad. But every year, on the anniversary of Marta's death, he returned to that field and knelt, just as he does now, with the cloth still wound around his hands. What makes this year different is that you're not alone. A girl stands just a few feet away, maybe 16, wearing a pendant carved from the same bone charms Marta used to wear. She watches Cedric with the kind of stillness that comes from knowledge, not curiosity, and then she kneels too. You don't ask her name, you don't have to. Historical fact, vows of silence were not uncommon among disgraced knights, or monks seeking penance, though few lasted longer than a year. Breaking one wasn't punishable, just deeply symbolic. Fringe fact, a remote monastery in the Eastern Highlands kept a scroll labelled The Confession of the Mute Knight. It's unsigned, but it tells of a healer burned alive, and a knight who never again let steel leave its scabbard. Debated idea, did Marta really die? One legend claims she survived the fire, escaped, and lived under a false name in a forest hamlet. The girl in the field? Perhaps a daughter, or a dream Cedric refuses to wake from. Scholars argue, but Cedric never does. You leave the field as the sun climbs higher, casting long shadows behind the kneeling figures. You don't look back. Some love stories are loud, shouted from balconies and etched into stained glass, but others are quieter, deeper, like roots buried under stone still holding everything up long after the world has forgotten why. The church bells are ringing, and you're already too late. They toll slowly, methodically, each one a hammer blow echoing across the village green. The sun's barely up, but the wedding is already underway. Flowers line the chapel path, white silk hangs from the yew trees, and you can smell roasted pheasant drifting from the manor kitchens nearby. The whole town has gathered to witness a union no one believes is romantic, but everyone agrees is useful. Is the sort of event where half the crowd cries and the other half counts silver. But somewhere in the woods beyond the chapel a man is running. He crashes through the underbrush with reckless speed, boots soaked, hair tangled, blood drying on one knuckle from a fist he didn't think he'd throw this morning. His name is Ivar, and this was supposed to be his wedding day. Not the one in the chapel, the one he planned in his head, with vows whispered in the dark to a woman in white, except the white wasn't silk, it was a nun's habit. And her name is Maris. Maris, once Sister Maris of St. Breda's Abbey. Where the walls were stone, the rules were iron, and love was entirely off the table. She took her vows at 17, traded her name for silence, her hair for a veil, and her future for obedience. Everyone assumed she'd vanish into a life of prayer, become another face in the candlelight. Everyone except Ivar. They met at a funeral. He was the groom-to-be of a dead girl, his first betrothal lost to illness. Maris was the nun assigned to sing the mass. Her voice broke on the last verse. He noticed, and after that he never forgot her face. Weeks later he began leaving offerings outside the abbey. Herbs, books, wildflowers tucked into the iron gate. She said nothing, didn't even leave replies, until one day he found a tiny note tucked under his ribbon. I cannot say yes, but I have not said no. And that was enough. They began to meet in secret, between Lords and Vespers near the brook that divided the abbey lands from the forest. They never touched at first, just talked. He told her about the books he read, the dreams he had, the hollow ache of trying to be someone he didn't even like. She told him what it felt like to be erased politely, to be called sister. So often she started to forget she had a name. Eventually the words gave way to fingers brushing, eyes lingering, a kiss that felt like a crime and a miracle at once. For a while they thought they could keep it hidden, that the world would look away long enough for them to build something between the cracks, but the abbess noticed. The villagers whispered. And worst of all, Ivar's father, an aging merchant with ambitions of minor nobility, decided his son needed a bride with land, not love. A match was arranged. Dowry agreed. Date set. Ivar didn't tell Maris. Not at first. He meant to, but the days slipped by and the shame clung like a second skin. When he finally confessed, she didn't cry, didn't scream. She only asked one question. Do you want me to stop hoping? He didn't answer. That was 3 weeks ago. Since then he's barely slept. The betrothal announcements went out, Maris disappeared, vanished from the abbey, her cell found empty, her veil folded neatly on the stone floor. No one claimed to know where she went. Ivar told himself it didn't matter, that maybe she had gone north, maybe she had joined a more remote priory, maybe it was over. Until this morning, when he woke to find a mark scratched into the bark of the old yew tree by the stream. A symbol they had used, 3 lines and a curl, her mark, still fresh. That's why he's running now, clothes unfastened, hair soaked with fog. Not toward the wedding, away from it, to the river, to her. He finds her there, standing ankle deep in water, wearing the white of a novice but no veil, hair loose, wild. She turns when she hears him and doesn't smile, not yet, just waits. He stumbles down the slope and nearly falls, breath ragged, no words. She finally speaks. You're late. And he laughs, collapses to his knees. Are you running too? I already did. They don't speak of plans, or the chaos they're leaving behind, only what they'll do next. Go to the coast maybe, find work in a place where no one cares about titles or vows. She tells him her real name, not Sister Maris, just Maris. He says it twice, and each time it sounds less like guilt and more like a beginning. Historical fact, nuns who broke their vows, especially through romantic or sexual relationships, were often sentenced to confinement or excommunication. Many abbeys quietly transferred or hid them to avoid public disgrace. Fringe fact, a small ruined chapel near the northern coast bears graffiti in Old Norse and Latin, etched by different hands. Among the carvings are 2 names, Maris and Ivar, and a date that matches the year of their disappearance. Debated idea. Did they really run? Some say they were caught and buried under false names. Others believe they fled by boat to the Shetland Isles. One theory suggests Maris posed as a merchant's apprentice for years, passing as a man, while Ivar worked as a fisherman. No one ever confirmed their fate. You stand now by the stream, water trickling past stones smoothed by time and footsteps. There's a tree here still, scarred with old symbols, almost invisible unless you know where to look. 1 curve, 3 lines, a promise scratched into bark. You can almost hear them, even now, arguing gently about who was later, who risked more, and who finally loved more stubbornly. The candles burn low in the scriptorium, their flames hissing softly as wax pools and drips down to stain the edges of parchment. You're in a cold stone room nestled deep in the heart of a monastery, one of those ancient draughty places where ink is more sacred than wine, and silence is enforced like dogma. Quills scratch in chorus, monks hunched over scrolls copying psalms, prayers, and occasionally secret histories. But in the far corner of the room, tucked behind a column where the candlelight barely touches, a different kind of story is being written. His name is Brother Alaric, and he's a scribe by training, a scholar by passion, and a man in the middle of something no one in this monastery would approve of. Not the abbot, not the monks, and certainly not God if you ask loudly enough. Because Alaric isn't writing what he's been told to. He's rewriting. Translating not just Latin scripture, but letters from a faraway land, brought to him by someone who, by all logic, should be his enemy. Someone who stole his heart while he was busy pretending not to have one. She is called Lale, the daughter of a pagan prince from the distant steppes, traded into the court of a neighbouring king to secure peace. A political hostage in practice, a guest in name. She was baptised in ceremony, forced to wear a Christian name no one remembers now, and given to the nuns of a convent outside the monastery walls. There she was taught to read and pray and nod at the right times, but she never forgot her mother tongue or her fury. Alaric met her by accident. He'd been summoned to the convent to assist in translating a crumbling manuscript found in a foreign tomb. The abbess insisted it was heretical and must be copied before being purified. Alaric saw the symbols and froze. They weren't nonsense, they were old Chagatai, a language he'd studied briefly, awkwardly, under a tutor long dead. Lala, overhearing his struggle, stepped forward and offered a translation, and just like that their lives entangled. The abbess dismissed her with a frown, muttering about boundaries and obedience, but Alaric found her again, under the pretense of needing help with the work. She agreed, though not out of obedience, out of curiosity. And in the quiet hours of their collaboration, something shifted. She challenged everything. Why did the monks copy lies as truth? Why were the gods she was born with so easily erased by ink? Why was Alaric afraid to say what he believed, even in private? He tried to argue, but the arguments turned into laughter. The laughter into stories. The stories into poetry. And then one night she recited a prayer in her native tongue, words he didn't understand, but felt like a song he had heard before in dreams. He kissed her then, gently, as if asking permission. She kissed him back, firmly, as if giving it. After that, everything became risk. They met in the scriptorium after midnight, Alaric locking the door with a key he wasn't supposed to have. He smuggled parchment to her, and she taught him the phrases of her homeland. She slipped him poems her mother had written. He translated them into Latin, hiding them among pages of liturgical text. One such page survives in an archive today, bearing a line that reads, "In golden ink, I have loved you in languages I was not allowed to speak." But secrets don't keep themselves. A monk named Brother Thomas, rigid, bitter, and deeply devout, grew suspicious. He saw the locked door, found the page, reported everything. The abbot didn't wait for the proof. L'Heir was accused of seduction and heresy. Alaric of treason to the cloth. They were separated immediately. Alaric was confined to a stone cell beneath the church, given only water and scripture. L'Heir was taken from the convent. No one said where. Rumours circled like vultures. Banishment, imprisonment, execution, no one knew. Alaric refused to speak. Refused to eat too for a time. He was finally broken not by pain but by the absence of her voice. The sound of her fingers on parchment. The pause she always took before challenging him. And then one night something impossible happened. A page appeared beneath his door. A note, written in both Latin and Chagatai. It read, "Your letters still breathe. I am free. I will wait until the spring rains." No one knows how it got there. The guards swore no one had come near the cell. The abbot called it a hoax. Alaric said nothing, just waited. When spring came, he vanished. One morning his cell was found empty, the lock unbroken, his robe left folded on the stone bench. All that remained was a single quill dipped in red ink, left standing upright in an inkwell, an old scribe's way of saying the story is done. Historical fact. Monasteries often served as centres for translation and manuscript preservation, particularly during times of political upheaval. Some scribes quietly copied secular or foreign texts against church orders. Fringe fact. A 14th century volume of translated poetry from the East includes a dedication in faded ink to the one who dared to teach the monk to sing. No author is listed. Debated idea, was Lala real or symbolic? Some historians believe she was a composite of several women trafficked into noble courts. Others insist the notes in Alaric's hand show evidence of a genuine linguistic exchange that could not have occurred without her. A few even suggest the pair fled to the borderlands and continued translating together under false names. You're standing now in the ruins of that old scriptorium. The roof is long gone, but the walls remain, carved with lines of poetry no monk would ever admit to knowing. In the cracks between stone, moss grows in familiar loops, almost like script, and in the quiet you swear you can still hear the sound of ink gliding across parchment, two hands writing side by side in a love that crossed every forbidden border. The crowd is gathered in the square, tight-packed and restless, like animals before a storm. You stand near the back, hood drawn low, though the sun is already rising and the guards are sharpening the blade. It's execution day in the town of Saint Mark, and everyone's here to see it. The air is sour with sweat and ash, and somewhere someone is selling roasted chestnuts, as if this were a festival instead of a funeral. You're not here for justice, you're here for love, or what's left of it. At the centre of the square is a wooden platform. On it, a man kneels, hands bound, shirt torn open to reveal a scar shaped like a crescent moon across his ribs. His name is Julian, and by nightfall he'll be dead. Not because he stole anything, not because he murdered, but because he loved someone he wasn't supposed to, and didn't run fast enough when the world found out. She's standing nearby, dressed in the colours of mourning. Not black. She can't afford the symbolism. Grey, like ashes. Her name is Abbott, daughter of a city alderman, promised to a merchant's son, and absolutely, unforgivably in love with the man kneeling before her. They met in a barn. Truly. No disguises, no ballads, just mud and horses, and an awkward tangle of limbs when Julian startled her while cleaning the stalls. He was a servant, technically a criminal, pardoned for war service, now working off his sentence under the city's indenture laws. She was a girl learning how to ride, how to flirt, how to breathe without asking her father first. At first, they were nothing. Passing smiles, silent glances, but it grew. He gave her a ribbon he found tangled in a fence post. She lent him a book she wasn't supposed to own. They met in the stable loft, never touching, just talking. Then one day the talking stopped, and the kissing began, and everything after that was an avalanche they couldn't stop. They didn't mean to fall in love. Not really. They just meant to survive, to feel something in a world that kept telling them what they could and couldn't be. And for a time it worked. They met in secret, wrote letters tucked into hollow fence rails, planned an escape. They'd take a boat north, pretend to be brother and sister, start over. But the stable boy saw them, told the priest told the alderman, and suddenly Julian was accused of seduction, of witchcraft even. How else could a man with no name ensnare a girl with a dowry? They dragged him from the barn. Abbott tried to intervene, stood between the guards and Julian screaming. She was slapped, silenced, locked in her room. At trial they read his letters aloud, twisting love into manipulation. They called him ungrateful, dangerous, said he'd used her, said he planned to kill her family. He never defended himself, not once, just stared at her with eyes that didn't blink, as if memorizing her face before it vanished behind smoke. And now, here he is, kneeling before a crowd that already thinks him dead. The executioner steps forward. Abbott moves. She slips through the crowd like a shadow, breaking from her guards in one motion, bare feet slapping stone. She doesn't care anymore, not about family, not about dowry, just about this one thing, saying goodbye before the blade drops. She throws her arms around Julian. Guards rush forward, but the crowd hesitates. And in that hesitation something extraordinary happens. Everyone goes still. She whispers something in his ear. He smiles, and then the moment is gone. They drag her back. The sword falls. The crowd erupts in gasps. Some cheer, some weep. A few turn away. Abbott does not scream. Later she refuses to return home. Leaves the city, no one knows where. But months later, in a quiet chapel on the coast, a traveller finds a page pinned to a pew. A prayer written in a woman's hand. It reads, "Let no law silence what the heart remembers." Historical fact. Public executions were often used not only for punishment but for propaganda, especially in cases involving class mixing or threats to social hierarchy. Fringe fact. In a side chapel of St. Mark's Cathedral, a stained glass window added decades later depicts a nameless woman weeping beside a man in chains. The church denies the figures represent Julian and Abbott, but the resemblance is uncanny. Debated idea. Did Julian truly die, or was his execution staged? One conspiratorial version of the tale claims the blade was dulled, the executioner paid off, and Julian smuggled away in a coffin meant for another prisoner. The theory is supported by a merchant's ledger listing a sudden, unexplained delivery of a sealed crate to a northern port the very next day. You return now to the square, long since repaved, the platform gone, but if you look closely beneath the edge of a stone fountain, you'll find a carving, 2 initials, J and S, joined by a knot. It isn't large, it isn't loud, but it's still there, like the echo of a kiss, like the breath caught between love and loss, like a man who knelt and a woman who didn't look away. The wind whips through broken shutters as you step into the cold, damp studio. It smells of linseed oil, old wood, and something older still, maybe longing, maybe regret. This place hasn't seen a finished canvas in years, but in the dust and shadows you can still feel the intensity that once electrified the air. The man who worked here was a painter, yes, but more than that, a man haunted by the image of someone he shouldn't have loved. Not just because she was married, not just because she was nobility, but because she was never meant to be seen, not like that. His name was Laurent, a middling artist in a middling town scraping out a living painting, religious icons and saintly murals for churches that paid in chickens and favours. He had the kind of talent that could have soared but not the temperament. He was moody, unreliable, too good to be obedient, not good enough to be forgiven. Which is probably why he said yes when Baron Aldemar requested a portrait of his young wife, Lady Elellanena. The Baron wanted it for her birthday, something dignified, modest. "Paint her as she ought to be," he said, with a wink that curdled Laurent's stomach. When Elaine first entered the studio, everything else stopped. She wasn't the most beautiful woman he'd seen, but there was something about her, sharp eyes softened by thought, a posture that pretended to submit but kept one shoulder just slightly turned, as if to say, "Don't presume to know me." She sat for the portrait 3 days a week, always accompanied by a chaperone at first. But by the second week, the woman stopped coming. Laurent didn't ask why. They spoke little, she brought books, he painted, but in silence something bloomed. He studied her, yes, but not just her face. Her expression when she forgot he was there, the way she touched the pages of her book like they were fragile things, and Elaine watched him back, watched his fingers stained with pigment, his brow furrowed in concentration. She watched the way he looked at her, not like a subject, but like a mystery he wanted to solve slowly. One afternoon, while adjusting the light from the window, their hands brushed. That was all. The next day she arrived early. The day after that she stayed late. And then one morning he unveiled the portrait and she gasped. It wasn't what the Baron wanted. It wasn't modest, it wasn't political. It was true. She wasn't adorned or posed. She wasn't made divine. She was raw and real and radiant. The look in her eyes was defiant, alive, and unmistakably in love. She told him to destroy it. He didn't. Instead, he painted her again and again, dozens of canvases, each one hidden behind the false back of a cupboard in the studio. In them she smiled, she wept, she danced. She stared directly at him as if she were daring history to blink. It couldn't last. Someone always talks. A neighbour, a maid, a rival artist. One of them told the Baron. The studio was raided in the night. Laurent beaten. The painting slashed. The portrait for the Baron taken. It now hangs in a fortress gallery under the title Lady with the Veil, her name scrubbed from the record. Laurent was imprisoned for dishonouring a noble house. Not executed. His skill still had value, but he was forbidden from painting again. A lifetime ban. His right hand was broken in 3 places. He would never hold a brush the same way again. As for Elaine, she was sent to her family's distant estate, her correspondence restricted, her movements watched. Some say she starved herself. Others say she began to paint alone in a locked room no one entered. Years passed. Laurent never fully healed. But he didn't vanish either. He taught apprentices. He made ink sketches with his left hand, and every year, on the date of her last sitting, he placed a single white flower on the window ledge of the studio, even after it was condemned, even after no one else remembered her face. Then one spring, someone found a canvas hidden beneath the floorboards during renovations, untouched. It shows a woman in profile, eyes closed, wind lifting her hair. She is smiling. Historical fact, in many medieval courts, artists were legally considered servants and could be punished or imprisoned for perceived moral failings involving nobility, even without evidence. Fringe fact, a coded manuscript discovered in the margins of a late 14th century artist's notebook references a ghost of white petals who appears in abandoned studios to mourn the lost muses of the brush. Some believe it refers to Elaine. Debated idea. Was Laurent ever reunited with her? Men say he fled to Italy and took a new name. Others insist Elaine escaped her exile and lived anonymously in a convent, where an unknown woman occasionally sent blank canvases to a man in the north. One theory suggests their love continued in the only way it could, through painted memory. You stand now in the old studio, dust shifting in the beams of light. The walls are bare. The air still smells of pigment. and if you listen closely you can almost hear the hush of breath, the soft scrape of a brush across canvas, and the quiet, unbreakable truth that art remembers what people are too afraid to say. Twilight slides in over the hills like spilled ink, thick and slow, bleeding into the sky. You're standing on a wind-swept ridge overlooking the ruins of a fortress long abandoned, just skeletal towers and broken walls now, overgrown with ivy and memory. No banners fly here, no guards pace the battlements, but once this place was a stronghold of power and defiance. Once it was the hiding place of a love so reckless, so improbable it needed a fortress to survive. This is where Edric the usurper hid the princess he was never supposed to touch. Not a fairy tale princess, not the kind that sings to birds or waits for rescue. Her name was Elellanena of Garamond, heir to the Western throne, rider of war horses, breaker of court etiquette, a woman known more for wielding a longsword than for weaving embroidery. She had been betrothed twice before the age of 20, once to a boy who died of fever, once to a duke who lived but disgusted her. Neither pairing stuck. Edric was not nobility, not truly. He'd fought in the wars that gave Garamond its uneasy peace, clawed his way up through the ranks with nothing but grit, a sharp mind, and a penchant for winning battles that should have gone the other way. The court called him vulgar, dangerous, but the people called him their lord, rough-edged, unpredictable, and loyal to none but them. Their first meeting was political. Edric had been summoned to court to negotiate the garrisoning of his soldiers along Eleanor's border. She greeted him in full armour. He offered no bow. She smirked. And he said, "Well, no one warned me the princess was already wearing a crown." She laughed. Once. After that, they clashed often. Over policy, tactics, supply routes. She called him arrogant. He called her reckless. And then, one night, over shared wine and a fire that wouldn't stay lit, they kissed like two people who had been fighting the inevitable for far too long. It was not meant to be. Elellanena was the blood heir. She was duty, legacy, dowry incarnate. Edric was a veteran with no title, no lands except what he'd claimed by sword. And yet they kept meeting, under moonlight in the training yard, in the old library with dust between them, behind the chapel as bells rang out for services they never attended. When her father fell ill and the succession crisis broke open like a cracked egg, everything unravelled. Elellanena was declared unfit to rule alone. The council arranged a political marriage with a northern prince. Edric, outspoken and fiercely loyal to her, was accused of treason. They came for him at dawn. He escaped through a servant's tunnel. She followed before the sun had risen. They rode hard for the border and vanished into the mist. And here, on this remote hilltop in a forgotten stronghold once built by outlaws, they stayed. For weeks, then months. They were hunted, branded fugitives, but in this crumbling stone they lived like monarchs of their own choosing. She trained with him by day, plotted war councils by candlelight, laughed with her mouth wide and free. He rebuilt the old armoury, grew vegetables, wrote her letters even though she slept beside him. They knew it wouldn't last. Eventually, their enemies came. The northern prince raised an army. The council offered a pardon for her, not for Edric. They refused to surrender. The fortress held for 3 days under siege, and on the 4th morning a white flag was raised. Not in surrender, in escape. A decoy rode out wearing Eleanor's cloak. By the time the fortress was stormed, the real Elellanena and Edric were gone. No one knows where they went. Some say they fled to the islands, lived in anonymity, raised goats and 2 daughters who never knew their mother's name meant crown. Others say Elellanena disguised herself as a mercenary and continued fighting under Edric's command for years. A handful of whispers suggest they made their way east and joined the wandering court of exiles, trading their pasts for myths. Historical fact: fortified hilltop redoubts were often used as temporary strongholds for noble families in rebellion or retreat. Many were never retaken but simply forgotten over time. Fringe fact: a 15th century manuscript discovered in a merchant's trunk references a ballad titled The Lion's Bride, which was quickly banned across 3 kingdoms. It tells of a princess who married a soldier in secret and ruled with him from a throne made of rubble. Debated idea. Did Elellanena ever reclaim her title? Some believe she returned under a false identity and served on her cousin's council. Others argue she died in childbirth in a border village, and her daughters became smiths, not queens. One obscure chronicler insists she was captured and executed, but the lack of record is suspicious for someone of royal blood. You step now into the remnants of what was once the Great Hall. The roof is long gone, ivy coats the hearth, but carved into the stone arch above the doorway is a phrase, worn but readable. Not stolen, chosen. Whether they lived as rulers or ghosts, their love was not quiet. It was a rebellion, a siege, a fortress built on stubbornness and fire. So here you are, the journey's end. 30 stories folded into night-like petals, each one a secret the world tried to bury under dust and dogma but couldn't quite keep down. You've travelled through shadowy chapels, wind-blasted castles, mossy forests and crumbling city squares. You've met nuns who ran, pirates who kissed like promises, queens who bent crowns for kisses, and scribes who learned that love sometimes speaks in languages no one dares to translate. Maybe you started this thinking of forbidden love as a romantic fantasy, clandestine kisses, whispered oaths and candlelight. But now you know it's something heavier, riskier. These stories didn't just bend the rules, they lit them on theirs. Every one of these lovers gambled with their names, their futures, sometimes their lives, for a single breath of honesty in a world trained to punish it. Some escaped, some didn't. Some burned, some bloomed, and some vanished so completely we only know them through half-told songs and carvings worn down by time. But that's the magic, isn't it? That they loved anyway. And now, as your room grows quieter and your mind settles, maybe you feel something tugging at you. A sense that the past isn't just behind us, it's humming beneath our feet. A reminder that love, real love, has always been wild, complicated, and a little bit dangerous, and always worth it. So take a deep breath, close your eyes, let the candle gutter out. Because the night is long, the world is still full of secrets, and love, whatever form it takes, has never asked permission to endure.